A helicopter's rotors are really its wings, and like a large metal insect, it can fold them away to make the best use of cramped space aboard ship. The helicopter can be used as a platform to deliver people to inaccessible places, and it doesn't have to set down or even stop to do it. It can drop its human load over water or perform exactly the same service over land. To the helicopter, it makes very little difference. And the helicopter doesn't have to carry its load inside. It can be used as a towing vehicle, even for loads that seem impossibly large. The helicopter's load can be lethal. For something that normally flies low and slow, it can be a deadly weapon system. It can be used to preserve and encourage life. This helicopter is fertilizing a forest. Its low speed and maneuverability make it perfect for the job. What it fertilized, it can also harvest. And it can do that in such a way as to minimize the damage to the rest of the environment. There are small lifting helicopters and very big lifting helicopters, capable of moving loads of many tons, in ways and to places no crane fixed to the ground can match. These loads can be slung outside the helicopter or carried inside and arranged so they can be unloaded with the shortest possible time on the ground. The helicopter's unique ability to hover over a fixed point makes it the perfect rescue vehicle, and in less than 50 years of practical operation, it has saved millions of lives. Some of these lives have been saved by helicopters acting as firefighting machines. In air crashes, they've used their rotor downwash to blow the flames, allowing the firefighting crew to push through to the wreck. With the helicopter's assistance, the firefighters could reach the wreck sooner, and those extra seconds have often made the difference between life and death. On the field of battle, the helicopter has completely changed the way casualties are treated. Before the helicopter came along, seriously wounded troops were as good as dead. From the time of the Korean War and right through Vietnam, helicopters made it possible to pick up gravely wounded soldiers and get them to medical attention within minutes. The helicopter was indeed an angel of mercy, a role foreseen by helicopter pioneer Igor Sikorsky. His son, Sergei.
I think that actually this is one of the sources of greatest pride and pleasure to Igor Sikorsky, to my father, was that from the very beginning, he foresaw its use as a unique instrument for the saving of human lives. And by the time he passed away in the very early 1970s, he had seen that role of the helicopter proved time and time again.
The helicopter's control system allows it to perform maneuvers impossible in any other aircraft. But while it's extremely maneuverable, it can also provide a very stable platform. This fixed camera in the cockpit of a large helicopter shows just how precisely a target can be held over a long approach. The control system that allows a helicopter to perform its magic took years of experimentation to develop. But since the principles of helicopter control were established in the early 1940s, the basics have remained the same. This is an early helicopter from the Bell Company. It has 3 main helicopter controls. The first of these is called the cyclic. It's connected to the main rotor and controls the direction of the helicopter. The helicopter will move in the direction the cyclic is pushed, forward or backward, or to either side. Just how this works, we'll come back to in a moment. The collective pitch lever adjusts the pitch or angle of the rotor blades. Pull it up and the helicopter will rise. Push it down and the helicopter will descend. The foot pedals are connected to the tail rotor. Push the left pedal and the helicopter will spin on its axis to the left. Push the right pedal and it will spin to the right. Now let's look at the rotors themselves. The collective lever changes the angle of each blade equally, so the helicopter will rise or descend, or by choosing just the right angle, it can be made to hover. Small pitch changes of each rotor are going on automatically with every rotation or cycle of the blades, hence the term cyclic pitch. These changes keep the helicopter balanced, but when the pilot moves the cyclic control, it has the effect of tilting the rotors, and the helicopter will fly in the direction of tilt. If the pilot pushes the cyclic forward, the rotors tilt forward, and the effect is to drag the helicopter forward with them. Once in the air, the pilot uses the imaginary disc formed by the rotor to control the direction of the helicopter. Wherever the disc is tilting, the helicopter will follow. The mechanism that controls these rotor movements is very complex. Pitch changes are conveyed to the rotors by a system of rods connected to a device called a swash plate. Cyclic and collective pitch changes can happen at the same time, and this allows the helicopter to make its infinite variety of movements in the air. Control of engine power via the throttle is the final piece in the puzzle. This is one of Igor Sikorsky's first helicopters. Watch how it responds to changes in rotor angle as the pilot moves the cyclic control stick. The pilot spins the helicopter around by using the foot pedals to control the tail rotor. If there was no tail rotor, the helicopter would simply spin around in the opposite direction to the main rotor. This is caused by the torque or twisting force of the engine, and has been a major problem for helicopter designers ever since the first rotor system was developed. Several early designers adopted the vertical tail rotor on their helicopters and brought this unwanted spinning under control. The foot pedals control the pitch of the tail rotor blades. By increasing or reducing the pitch, the rotors either fight or give in to the twisting force of the engine, and so the helicopter will spin left or right. Because of this complicated control system, helicopters are harder to fly than fixed-wing aircraft. Early helicopters were very difficult to control and needed constant attention from pilots if they were to avoid accidents. Not every helicopter needs a tail rotor. This is a tandem arrangement with 2 main rotors, one at the back and one at the front. The rotors revolve in opposite directions and cancel out the torque of the engine. Another twin arrangement is the intermeshing rotor system, in which the rotors are placed side by side and actually cross over each other as they revolve in opposite directions. So with all these different systems, How tough is life for a helicopter pilot?
See, helicopter pilots are those people that know that if something hasn't gone wrong, it's going to go wrong pretty soon because you've got yourself so tied up in what you're doing. Certainly when you bring that helicopter up to a hover, you've got a collective down here, and you put some bite into the blades to get you off the ground to move more air. To move more air, you have to run a throttle here to go ahead and put more power off of the engines into that blade turning. At the same time, when those blades are turning, as you come off the ground, the fuselage wants to go ahead and follow those blades around. So you've got a tail rotor that's connected to your feet that you have to use to keep the front end lined up. And then you've got a stick in the center that tells you if you can go forward or backward or left or right in the movement while you're at a hover. Well, it's much more complicated.
But when you put it all together, the helicopter is capable of doing amazing things, as this Apache attack helicopter shows. The helicopter's greatest talent is its ability to hover motionless above a fixed point. This is what makes it so useful as a rescue vehicle. But it's also one of the most difficult things for a trainee pilot to master. The helicopter also has the unique ability to fly very low, following the contours of the Earth. But what if you're in a helicopter and the engine fails? You simply float back to Earth, with the rotor spinning like a sycamore seed. It's called auto-rotation, and it's the helicopter equivalent of gliding. So they don't fall out of the sky. But how safe are helicopters? Dr. Harry Robertson, director of the International Center for Safety Education.
If helicopters are taken care of properly, like the manufacturer suggests, coupled with what good common sense suggests, it's probably the safest form of aerial flying that man has come up with so far, safer than even balloons.
The problem of vertical flight can be tackled in several different ways. There is more than one possible helicopter control system. Which one is chosen for a particular helicopter comes down to the taste of the designer and the job the helicopter is meant to do. The sinister, aggressive look of the Hughes Apache leaves no doubt about its role. It's a highly efficient helicopter of war, and it uses the classic single main rotor and tail rotor configuration.
Any responsible engineer could prove to you that the single main lifting rotor, and then to steal power from that rotor to drive a small little rudder-type rotor, is improper and inefficient. And yet Igor Sikorsky felt that was the logical way to go. And it's interesting that today, this configuration that was so criticized when he first applied it is the dominant configuration. And in fact, roughly 95% of all of the helicopters in the world built since World War II are built with this same configuration.
The super high-tech Apache seems light years beyond the Sikorsky VS-300, the first successful helicopter with a single main rotor and tail rotor. But less than 50 years separate the two, and their basic layout is just about identical. The shape of early helicopters was largely dictated by their function and the layout of their control system. First, get them flying properly, and then worry about looks. The Piasecki flying banana, in spite of its cartoon appearance, was a highly practical machine. Its success led to a long line of big tandem rotor helicopters. Frank Piasecki, who pioneered the tandem layout, went to great pains to prove its efficiency.
And the tandem, no matter how we did it, no matter who did it in this comparison and calculation, the tandem always came out better. And the reason for it became fairly obvious when all of your power is going into lift, because the rotor, the counteracting the torque, was automatic by the fact that the two rotors turn in opposite directions. So that was fundamental.
The direct descendant of the Piasecki flying bananas is one of the most famous and successful helicopters of all time, the Boeing Vertol Chinook. 30 years since it first flew, it continues to give great service in both civil and military life. A different twin-rotor layout, the intermeshing side-by-side system, was another early approach to the problem of helicopter control. The system was developed in the 1940s and 50s by Charles Kaman. It became well known for its use on the Kaman Husky, a helicopter specializing in firefighting and search and rescue work. The smoothness and controllability of the intermeshing blades made it ideal for its job.
It's balanced at all times, and you just throw it a little bit out of balance, and that provides the torque to move the machine. And it's right here, right now. It's very comfortable, very easy, and no loss from that. Because what power you take out of one, you put back in the other a little bit, and it's very convenient.
This is one of Kaman's early helicopters using the intermeshing system. Its shape is different from those of the single-rotor and tandem helicopters. As in the cases of single-rotor and tandem types, the appearance of this intermeshing rotor helicopter has been dictated by its control layout. And so has this novel 1950s twin-rotor system. The rotors are on top of each other, and the pilot is on top of them. Although this machine didn't make a mark on history, the idea of two coaxial rotors has re-emerged in the Sikorsky advancing blade concept. The rotors revolve in opposite directions, so the helicopter doesn't need a tail rotor. Because blades on both sides of the helicopter are always advancing or traveling in the direction of flight, it gives great smoothness and stability and can fly faster than most conventional helicopters. In the 1940s and 50s, there were many experiments with rotors powered not by an engine, but by jets in the tips of the rotor blades. This is Little Henry, a McDonnell design from 1948. It was powered by ramjets at the end of each rotor. The same jet system was used in the Fairey Rotodyne, an English aircraft that landed and took off vertically, but behaved like a fixed-wing airplane in level flight. The Rotodyne performed well, but was defeated by its excessive noise and lack of political support. In the late 1960s, the Lockheed Aircraft Company produced a helicopter that appeared to have a conventional single-rotor layout. But there were subtle differences. Instead of just one tail rotor, it had two, one to control torque and the other for forward thrust. It also had small wings for lift. This combination made it a very fast aircraft. One other rotor combination that never quite made it was the side-by-side twin rotor. This is the oldest of all workable rotor systems and was revived in the 1940s by McDonnell in their HJH Whirlaway. The big two-engine Whirlaway never got past experimental status, and only one prototype was ever built. The tilt rotor offers the advantages of vertical takeoff and landing and airplane performance in level flight. It's the only major departure from the traditional helicopter in recent years that appears to have a chance of breaking new ground in the evolution of rotorcraft. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci, the great Italian artist and inventor, dreamed of a flying machine. He dreamed of a machine that could rise high, but he was not the first. Sergei Sikorsky.
The Chinese actually invented a string pull toy, a miniature helicopter that you would wind up by spinning it up with a string. And this toy wandered probably along the old Chinese silk trades all the way to Europe, where it is very definitely identified in manuscripts that start about the 11th and the 12th century, and is depicted very accurately in a painting at the cathedral at Le Mans of the Virgin and Christ Child. And the Christ Child actually is holding one of those tiny little helicopter models. There's no doubt about it, in my mind, that Da Vinci himself played with such a toy, because if you extrapolate the date of the painting at Le Mans, you realize already that the toy, which had wandered by this time into France, that the painting was made when Da Vinci himself was 12 years old. So there's every possibility that he played with something similar to that.
Leonardo's helicopter drawing was hundreds of years ahead of its time, but it was theory. In 1784, the French naturalist Lannoy built a model vertical flight machine. A string attached to a wooden bow was wound around the shaft. The bow bent and became a store of energy. The string was released, and under its own power, the model rose in the air. 60 years later, Englishman Sir George Cayley designed a full-scale helicopter with separate rotors for lift and forward flight. Although his rotor designs were quite practical, Cayley realized there was no power source capable of lifting it off the ground. Through the 19th century, the steam-powered helicopter fascinated dreamers and enthusiasts. In 1878, this Italian model flew with a novel steam jet engine. Jules Verne wrote the novel Clipper of the Clouds, but vertical flight remained a fantasy. In the 20th century, some early attempts at vertical flight tried lifting mechanisms quite different from the rotor. The Grey Goose did little but frighten the onlookers. But at least the decorative window appointment showed optimism. It was the era of cut and try, of high enthusiasm and bitter failure. Some of the attempts, like the bravely named Sky Car, must have looked hopeless even to early 20th century eyes. The principle of umbrella power was never to find a place in helicopter history. But some ideas, although not successful, were closer to the mark. In 1903, the Wright brothers had demonstrated that controlled flight was possible. Even with catapult assistance, their takeoffs required a horizontal run along the ground and space to accommodate it. In September 1907, Louis Breguet's helicopter, Gyroplane No. 1, rose 2 feet in the air. It was steadied from the ground and remained aloft for 2 minutes. A month later, Paul Cornu made the first true free helicopter flight. It lasted 20 seconds. But there was an unexpected problem. Both these French helicopters were very unstable. Their piston engine still produced very little power for its weight. But by 1918, the rotary aircraft engine had enough power to lift the Austrian PKZ-2 to 160 feet and allow it to remain there tethered for up to 30 minutes. In 1921, the Russian engineer George Debotezev directed the U.S. Army's first vertical flight program. Debotezev was confident of his ability to succeed where others had failed. He built his Army helicopter in secret in Dayton, Ohio. On December 18, 1922, it made its first flight. The flight report said that it remained at an altitude of between 1 and 6 feet for 1 minute and 42 seconds. In the following year, in other flights, it lifted up to 4 people. It set a duration record of 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and in another flight, reached an altitude of 30 feet. But in spite of all this success and an improving control system, it was considered too complex and unstable for practical use. Although the Army had spent $200,000 on the project, by 1924 it was abandoned. Debotezev's helicopter was consigned to the scrap heap. Emil Berliner was the inventor of the Victor phonograph. He began working with helicopters in 1908. By the early 1920s, his son had joined him. In 1922, they produced their most successful model. It had two separate rotors mounted on wings, with the engine in the nose. The engine drove the rotors so they rotated in opposite directions and canceled out each other's torque. There was a third propeller at the rear of the fuselage to increase or decrease lift. But too many problems arose. The rotors were too small, and the aircraft was unstable. The Berliners withdrew from the helicopter race. Etienne Omichenne was a French auto engineer who worked for the Peugeot company. In the 1920s, he made several unsuccessful attempts to build and fly large twin-rotor helicopters. Eventually, he fitted a gas-filled balloon to help the helicopter off the ground. It was a compromise, but Omichenne was persistent. By May 1924, he had abandoned the balloon and built a new helicopter. It established a world first by flying a 1-kilometer triangle course. But while his days of wrestling with balloon-assisted helicopters were over, even his new design was highly impractical. The Argentinian-born Marquis Pateras Pesquera was Omichenne's competitor in setting records. His helicopter was highly innovative. It had two coaxial rotors, each with a double-connected set of blades. The Pesquera helicopter was capable of some degree of cyclic pitch control, and Pesquera is recognized as a pioneer of control systems. His helicopter was the first to be capable of safe landing under auto-rotation in the event of engine failure. Pesquera achieved a speed record of 8 miles an hour for almost half a mile. His helicopter once reached an altitude of 30 feet. But the Pesquera helicopter was still not practical enough for sustained flight. In the early 1930s, Belgian Nicolas Florijn came up with a radical change in helicopter design. It was a tandem system, with rotors mounted on the front and rear. It flew for the first time in April 1933. In one flight, it reached an altitude of 20 feet and stayed there for 8 minutes. The rotors revolved in the same direction, and they had to be tilted on their axis to counteract torque. But Louis Breguet, whose helicopter rose 2 feet in 1907, was back in rotorcraft design. In 1935, he produced the gyroplane. It had coaxial rotors, and the blades were articulated for stability and control. It was the first helicopter to perform convincingly in free flight. This is not a helicopter. It's an autogyro. The propeller drives it forward, and the unpowered rotor acts like a wing. Spanish designer Juan de la Cierva had pioneered the autogyro in the early 1920s. His genius was to realize that an unpowered rotor would revolve in flight because of pressure of air on the underside. The autogyro was not a helicopter. It was an airplane capable of flying with rotary wings. In 1928, Cierva made the first autogyro flight across the English Channel. He'd already made his home in England, setting up the Cierva Autogyro Company in 1926. The company could not keep pace with demand, and Cierva was forced to license his design for others to build. Cierva developed the autogyro because of his interest in aircraft safety. Autogyros could take off quickly in a small space. They could also land with very little forward speed and a very short run, so they didn't need a runway. They would never stall, and if the engine failed, they would simply glide to Earth in auto-rotation under complete pilot control. In the 1930s, there was an international boom in the popularity of the autogyro. It was seen as the car of the sky, and Cierva traveled widely, demonstrating its capabilities and accepting international acclaim. One of the major centers of interest in the Autogyro was the United States of America. It was promoted there by fixed-wing aviator Harold Pitcairn, designer of a famous line of mailplanes. Pitcairn had bought a license from Sierra to manufacture autogyros in America. His main object was to use the basic safety of the autogyro to reduce accidents in the air. It was ironic that Juan de la Sierra would be killed not in an autogyro accident, but in the crash of a fixed-wing commercial airliner. In America, Harold Pitcairn set about building his own line of autogyros. His second model, the PCA-2, had short wings, which allowed it to use a control system generally similar to fixed-wing airplanes. It had ailerons for banking, elevators for dive and climb, and a rudder for directional control. The rotor was flexible, with hinges at the head. In forward flight, a simple rotor is unbalanced because more lift comes from the advancing side than the retreating side. Juan de la Sierra had developed hinges that allowed the rotors on the advancing side to rise without tilting the body of the aircraft. The PCA-2 had a system that brought the rotor up to speed without the need for long taxiing. The rotor was connected to the engine for startup and disengaged as the takeoff roll began. This system allowed the PCA-2 to make short, steep takeoffs. In the air, it could reach speeds up to 120 miles an hour. But if it had a headwind, it could match the speed of the wind and hover over a fixed point on the ground. The PCA-2 was very maneuverable and was capable of slow flight with a high degree of control. The idea here was that a line could be trailed at running speed and a person on the ground could attach or retrieve a payload. But it wasn't all business. The PCA-2 was capable of surprising tricks. The Autogyro proved to be an effective crop duster. It could fly slowly to give a thorough covering, and the draft from the rotors distributed the spray more thoroughly than a fixed-wing aircraft. The famous aviatrix Amelia Earhart had a special relationship with the Pitcairn Autogyro. She set an altitude record of 18,415 feet in the PCA-2 and also flew it coast to coast. Although more and more a part of the American skyline, an autogyro straying into a no-parking zone was still likely to turn heads. But public officials could be influenced by the offer of a joyride. In the early 1930s, autogyros became a familiar sight over the cities of America. They were promoted as the answer to urban traffic jams and were used for jobs like advertising and journalism. Right from the start, Pitcairn was unable to keep pace with the demand. He'd produced 58 autogyros before he sublicensed his franchise to Roderick and Wallace Kellett. The Kellett Company was to become a major rotorcraft producer over the next 20 years. The Pitcairn PA-22 had no wings. It used Sierra's principle of controlling the direction of flight by tilting the rotor. A small rudder helped maintain stability at low speeds. The PA-22 could make a jump takeoff, and in 1935, it flew the first mail run from the roof of the New Philadelphia Post Office to Camden Airport across the Delaware River. The Pitcairn AC-35 was special. It had something new to show the nation's capital. In the air, the AC-35 behaved just like any other autogyro, but on the ground, it could transfer engine power to the tail wheel. It could be steered through the front wheels and driven around like a car. When war in Europe broke out, Pitcairn demonstrated the PA-22 to the military. American helicopters were still not practical, and the Army was interested in the PA-22's ability to land in places inaccessible to other aircraft. The demonstration was impressive enough to convince the Army to buy the larger PA-33, which was capable of speeds up to 150 miles an hour. The growing threat of war caused the Army to look closely at a range of different Pitcairn autogyros. The PA-36 could jump takeoff with no forward run. On the ground, the rotors were set at zero pitch and spun hard by the engine. When the pilot suddenly released the rotors, they bit into the air and it leapt straight up. The pusher autogyro had potential for observation work, and 7 production models, designated XO61, were ordered by the Army. The PA-39 was built for British use and had the unique ability to land and take off on ships at sea, 3 years before this was possible with the American helicopter. This gave it potential as a weapon to protect transatlantic convoys from German U-boats. German sea power was a problem for the British, but German air power had a real technological edge over the rest of the world. In August 1939, the gas turbine-powered Heinkel HE-178 had flown. Fortunately for the Allied forces, the German Luftwaffe failed to capitalize on its lead in jet-powered fixed-wing aircraft. But the Germans had another technological edge, one they had established as early as 1936. They had a practical, flyable rotorcraft, not an autogyro, but a true helicopter, the Vexed FW-61. The FW-61 made repeated sustained flights, and in 1937 had stayed in the air for over an hour. It could lift vertically off the ground, had reached altitudes of 8,000 feet, and could fly at 77 miles an hour. One of the test pilots was the famous Hanna Reich. In 1938, she began a series of demonstration flights to the German public. In February, she made the world's first indoor helicopter flight in the Deutschland Hall in Berlin. This demonstration was repeated daily over the next 2 weeks inside the 100 by 300-foot auditorium. The FW-61 was built from the fuselage of an FW-44 biplane trainer. It had no wings and was lifted by 2 rotors raised high on outriggers. Counter-rotation canceled the effect of torque from the BMW radial engine. The Vexed FW-61 was a milestone in vertical flight, and it gave the Germans leadership in the helicopter field. The flimsy little Vexed FA-330 was not a powered helicopter. It was an automotive kite, designed to be towed by a submarine and used for reconnaissance. It needed a forward speed of 17 miles an hour to become airborne. This is a test flight, but 200 were built and introduced to active service on U-boats. The first German helicopter to go into production was the Flettner 282. It made its first flight in 1940, and the German Navy eventually ordered a production run of 1,000. But only 22 prototypes were completed. In 1942, it became the world's first helicopter in operational military service. It was designed for a variety of tasks in the German Navy, including liaison and communication. One is said to have landed on a moving submarine. Flettner pioneered the system in which two side-by-side rotors were geared to intermesh and rotate in opposite directions. It was stable and reliable, once flying for 95 hours with no repairs or replacements. In America in 1940, the most promising rotorcraft was still the Autogyro, with its ability to perform a jump takeoff. But soon that would change. Igor Sikorsky, a white Russian refugee who came to America in 1919, would change forever the shape of the helicopter. On December 8, 1941, Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. On that day, America declared war on Japan. And on that same day, in a little field in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the American helicopter came of age. A young pilot, Charles Lester Morris, climbed into the seat of the world's first workable single-rotor helicopter, the Sikorsky VS-300. A new control system was about to be tested. A full cyclic pitch main rotor to control direction of flight, and a small vertical tail rotor to swing the helicopter on its axis. A control system still used in 90% of present-day helicopters. After a few seconds, it began to rock in the air, and Morris was forced to set it back down on the ground. For the helicopter's designer, Igor Sikorsky, the flight must have been a disappointment. But within a month, the VS-300 would be flying beautifully. Igor Sikorsky was born in Kiev, Russia in 1889. He grew up in a home full of books and conversation. He read works of Jules Verne about balloons and vertical flight machines, and listened to the fireside stories told by his mother. Legends of Icarus and Bucephalus. The legends of flight.
I think the legend of the helicopter goes back a very, very long way. Because there's no doubt about it that man has dreamt of flying for hundreds of thousands of years, created legends of the flying carpets, the flying thrones, Pegasus, Bucephalus. All of these dreams, interestingly, had one thing in common. All of them were vertical takeoff and landing machines. None of these required a runway. And I think it was with dreams such as these that my father grew up, and that's where this lifelong love affair with a helicopter started.
It was said that Leonardo da Vinci experimented with air screws like that. A number of other people tried to build helicopters. I myself attempted to build two in 1909 and 1910.
These two crude helicopters were inspired by stories of the Wright brothers and a visit to Paris in 1909, where Sikorsky met and talked with some of the most famous French aviators of the day. But while Sikorsky's passion was for vertical flight, Russia at the time needed fixed-wing aircraft. Sikorsky became an airplane designer. His success was immediate. And then the power of his ambition began to show. He designed and built the world's first four-engine aircraft and called it, appropriately, the Grand. He learned to fly and became his own test pilot. In 1917, the Russian Revolution came, and with it, the great emigration of white Russian refugees. Igor joined the flood. But New York in 1919 was by no means the promised land. Times were tough for refugees, and there were no opportunities for a white Russian aircraft designer. Ironically, it was a group of other white Russian immigrants who helped him.
It was a number of these white Russian refugees eventually, who of course had all heard or had known of my father's work in Russia, that convinced him to try again. And they all pooled their money, and it was with a very significant amount of $800 in cash that they started work in the backyard of a chicken farm just outside of Roosevelt Field on Long Island. These 12 or 14 Russians actually donated their labor. They worked for free and started the company. At a very critical point, just as they had it nearly completed, They ran out of money. And it was then that a very great Russian composer and concert pianist named Sergei Rachmaninoff came to the aid of this struggling company and gave at that time, the very significant sum of $5,000.
In the early 1930s, Sikorsky joined forces with transatlantic hero Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh's energy was now directed at international travel, and the large Sikorsky flying boats were just right for exploring potential airline routes across the oceans of the world. There was no time for Sikorsky's first love, the helicopter.
While this is underway, it would not be wise to start something new, because it is not. Helicopter was not a project which I could just to charge to the engineers to do something about, and to test pilot to test and to do something about it also. It was a thing which called for attention, I would say love, I would say all energy, knowledge, and support which a man can put in.
Even so, the helicopter was never far from his mind. In 1931, he successfully patented a single rotor design. Young Sergei Sikorsky did what he could to help.
I was already growing up. I remember very, very clearly building small balsa wood models of these helicopters for my father's use in demonstrating them, first of all, to his own engineering people, many of whom, mind you, were very skeptical of the idea of abandoning the flying boat and getting into the helicopter.
But by late 1939, Igor Sikorsky had built and was attempting to fly the first crude form of his VS-300 helicopter.
You climb aboard this machine and you start up the engine and you try to fly it, never having flown a machine before in your life. So quite literally, at the age of 50, he went back and was retracing those same pioneering emotions that he had had at the age of 19, 20, and 21 when he built his own airplane without knowing how to build it, and then climbed aboard and tried to teach himself to fly while he was test flying this aircraft.
Igor Sikorsky was once again entering new territory.
In addition to all of this problem of literally walking out on very thin ice with a totally new and untested principle, was a very minor problem that Igor Sikorsky had never flown a helicopter before in his life. No one had. So first he had to teach himself to fly the machine.
The VS-300 had a cyclic pitch main rotor and a vertical tail rotor to control direction. But learning to fly it wasn't easy.
You had to lift the aircraft off the ground, teach yourself to hold it off the ground, say a foot or 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and then teach yourself how to be able to control the machine so that it stays within more or less 1 or 2 feet. That was the secret. Later, the challenge of slowly increasing forward flight called for another set of solutions, called for another set of redesigning of the main rotor head, called for nearly another year and a half of very hard, difficult work.
Part of this delay was caused by an incident on December 9, 1939. Serge Gluarev was the pilot. Stability and control were still very limited. A simple, unexpected gust of wind was too much to deal with. Serge Gluarev was not injured, but the VS-300 was, and Igor Sikorsky decided on another approach. He replaced the cyclic pitch control with 2 small horizontal rotors. Unequal pitch change on these rotors would roll the machine left or right. Equal pitch change would lift or drop the tail. It appeared to work quite well, and in March 1940, it was tested in flight. Sikorsky made many flights of 20 minutes or more, and quickly learned to hover it, or move it backwards or sideways, but the controls were still uncertain. The first public demonstration, with Igor Sikorsky as pilot, underlined a weakness of this control system. While a hover was reasonably controllable, in forward flight, downwash from the main rotor disturbed the rear rotors and caused instability. Controlling the machine was very difficult, and often, a quick return to the Earth was the only safe course.
I remember one of my father's closest friends and cohorts on the helicopter project, also a white Russian refugee with a rather intriguing accent, saying, "It was very interesting time. It was time of educated guess and crystal ball." And that's the way the helicopter was designed.
Igor Sikorsky now set out to analyze and cure the forward flight problem. On October 9, 1940, after weeks of test flights, he was making a series of forward runs about 20 feet above the ground when one of the rear pylons snapped away. The VS-300 crashed again. Igor, unhurt, stood for a long moment looking at the wreckage. Then he said, "I think I'll get her home now."
You really never knew whether it was the machine, whether the design was at fault or the test pilot was at fault. But I remember Dad with a grin in his eye saying, since both responsibilities were concentrated in one person, namely myself, I couldn't put the blame on anyone else. And I had to accept it, repair the machine, and carry on.
He did. And he got on with the task of refining the design and making it work. The pylons were swept back, and the tips raised to get them out of the downwash. The torque rotor was also raised on its own new pylon. In April 1941, Igor tackled the world helicopter endurance record with the VS-300 in this configuration. Igor Sikorsky's new world record was 1 hour, 32 minutes, and 26 seconds. Tests continued on this modified T-bone layout. Forward flight was now possible, and its controllability was greatly extended. Earlier in 1941, the Army Air Corps had been impressed enough with the helicopter to order a two-place version, with this control system to be called the XR-4. The encouraging performance of the VS-300 brought Igor Sikorsky closer to a long-held dream: to build a vehicle that could go anywhere, regardless of terrain, and set itself down in confined spaces on land or water, something that would give, in Igor Sikorsky's words, unlimited freedom of transportation. At the time, the helicopter's potential to do things no airplane could do was not always obvious.
I remember a good friend of mine and a very prominent designer, scientist in aviation asked, when would the helicopter go faster than the airplane? Do you know that? I said, yes, I know. The answer is never. When would the helicopter be more efficient than the airplane? Do you know that? I also said, yes, I know that. Never. But I said that helicopter will do a number of jobs which no airplane will do, and which in fact nothing else will do except a helicopter.
Charles Lester Morris made his first flight in the VS-300 in May 1941. Because of the difficulty of forward flight, he spent most of his time learning to hover and move backwards and sideways. In 1987, Les Morris spoke about those pioneering days and the need for Sikorsky to make major changes if the VS-300 was to be truly flyable.
So early in the summer of 1941, the decision was made to return to cyclic pitch control in the VS-300 helicopter. It would be so much simpler than having those awkward and cumbersome tail rotor outriggers. We would try to do it in two stages. First, we would get rid of the outriggers, of course. Then we would use cyclic pitch control just to the lateral control of the machine, rolling it left and right. And for longitudinal control, we would use a single horizontal tail rotor mounted on a tower high above the tail, well out of the downwash air from the main rotor. In early August we rolled the machine out with this new arrangement, and there were a lot of adjustments and changes to be made. But on August 14th, 1941, remember that date, we suddenly discovered in one day that we had a completely flyable helicopter, all in one day.
Les Morris's first flight with the new control layout was a revelation. He was able to do forward runs of 70 miles an hour, quick stops, backup, and do things they'd only dreamed of with the old system, and no problems developed. Even so, Igor Sikorsky decided that this was not the right control system for the new Army helicopter, the Sikorsky XR-4, and since the VS-300 was the test vehicle, it would be modified to test the next stage of control development.
So the beautiful, flyable little VS-300 was once again torn apart. The tail tower was removed, and the rotor hub was realigned for full cyclic pitch control. On December 8, 1941, the day that the United States declared herself at war with Japan, we rolled the ship out for the first trial.
After the elation of his previous flights in the VS-300, Les Morris's first experience with the cyclic pitch version was a disappointment. This flight introduced doubts into the minds of the whole team, and they had to back off the test program to analyze the situation. What was wrong? Was it part of the rotor system, or was it something to do with the whole design? Some months earlier, the oil dampeners, or oleo struts, had been removed from the rotor blades. And as it turned out, that was the problem.
The old oleo struts were recalled to active service, but they were installed at the rotor hub in such a way that they would damp the blades in the horizontal plane. Like a miracle from the Dark Ages, they turned the trick. Flights were made forward, backward, and sideward, and no wobble or resonance was detected. Thus, on the last day of 1941, the VS-300 demonstrated another completely satisfactory control system.
At last, they had it right. The classic Sikorsky configuration had arrived. A single main rotor with full cyclic control, and a small vertical anti-torque rotor with variable pitch. Sikorsky's dream of unlimited freedom of transportation was within reach, but he also saw the helicopter as a means of saving lives. Now, with control problems apparently solved, there was no limit to what might be achieved. Igor Sikorsky had indeed taken the chance to live his life over again. For the second time, he had built a flying machine without knowing how, and had taught himself to fly it. This was the final version of the VS-300, the culmination of 3.5 years of development. The name was still the same, but not much else was.
Probably, having lived through much of the development of the S-300, I can say with some minor confidence that the only pieces of the helicopter that are identical to that first machine that lifted off in September 1939 are the pilot's seat and certain of the structure around the engine. I would dare say everything else was bent, broken, smashed, or modified during the 3.5 years of the helicopter's existence.
And now, the race was on to educate the public and decision-makers about the virtues of the helicopter. Demonstrations of extreme controllability were the order of the day. The wide-open spaces were out. The trick now was to land in the smallest area you could fit. The VS-300 successor, the XR-4, was formally accepted by the Army on May 30, 1942, and went into production as the R4. As it demonstrates here, even with the power off and auto rotation, it could come very close to landing on a handkerchief. Igor Sikorsky's helicopters had already begun to change the face of aviation, and he had achieved what the cynics had said was impossible.
Any responsible engineer could prove to you that the single main lifting rotor, and then to steal power from that rotor to drive a small little rudder-type rotor, is improper and inefficient. And yet Igor Sikorsky felt that was the logical way to go. And it's interesting that today, this configuration that was so criticized when he first applied it is the dominant configuration. And in fact, roughly 95% of all of the helicopters in the world built since World War II are built with this same configuration.
Igor Sikorsky died in 1972. He saw 30 vibrant years of helicopter development, and for those years saw how his pioneering work came to change the face of 20th century life. But the helicopter was not his only passion. Like his Renaissance forerunner, Leonardo da Vinci, his interests were wide-ranging, and he was very good at a great many things.
The further away he gets, the more we realize what a great and unique person he was. Not only as an aeronautical engineer, not only as a very, very gifted test pilot, but also as a philosopher, as a historian, as an amateur astronomer, also as a very brilliant archaeologist and historian. I think he could have been a very, very great success in a great many professions. We're just lucky that he chose aviation as his first love.
Korea, 1952. Badly wounded casualties are evacuated from a frontline MASH unit. Their savior is a revolutionary newcomer to the theater of war, the Angel of Mercy, the Bell 47 helicopter. The Bell 47 is immediately recognizable with its bubble canopy and distinctive dragonfly shape. But its primitive ancestor, a model built in 1931 by designer Arthur Young, was very different. It was a clumsy affair, driven by propellers on the end of the rotor blades. It would fly, but without stability. After 9 years of experimentation, a new model emerged from Arthur Young's barn in Paoli, Pennsylvania. Its rotor blades were hinged at the mast. To the surprise of many experts, Young had found that these hinged blades would follow the angle of the mast, no matter where it tilted. There was a second coaxial rotor, which revolved slowly in the opposite direction to the main rotor, and canceled out its tendency to twist the whole machine. Power was fed to the electric motor through a cable and controlled by a rheostat. Stability was still a problem. At a conference in Philadelphia in 1938, Igor Sikorsky raised a possible solution. Arthur Young was there.
I heard Sikorsky, and I was much impressed by his proposal to use a tail rotor with a single lift rotor, rather than the more complicated system which I'd been thinking of as an alternative to my first idea. The coaxial rotors, two going in opposite directions.
But before he got involved with the tail rotor, Young came out with his own special innovation, the stabilizer bar.
And I finally hit on this bar thing, which you can think of like a tightrope walker's bar. It maintains a horizon that keeps independent of the mast.
And it worked. Outdoor performance was a great improvement over the previous model, and for the first time, stable flight was possible in a wind. But there was still no directional control. Young could only vary the power of the 110-volt motor for climb and descent. Then came the flywheel, which could be tilted by remote control, causing the rotors to follow the angle of tilt. Directional control was suddenly possible. Young added Sikorsky's idea of the anti-torque tail rotor and came up with a new model. A beautiful, controllable helicopter, about 1/6 full scale. Not free yet, still electric-powered and controlled by cable, but ready to fly. And that same model, color a little faded after 50 years, still sits in Arthur Young's barn in Pennsylvania.
Now, first of all, we have a two-bladed rotor, 1, 2, and that's on a seesaw pivot. It makes it independent of the mast. But in addition to that, we have this other motion, which is this way, twisting the rotor, and that gives the control. Now notice that the twisting comes to this flywheel up here. Well, this flywheel normally maintains a horizontal position and hence keeps the rotor in a horizontal position even when the mast swings under it. That upper flywheel stays flat. The other thing is to transmit the inclination from these magnets, 4 magnets, which through these plungers tip what's called a swash plate, that's this black thing that I'm holding. And that in turn tips the flywheel, which tips the rotor. So that gives you the control. Of course, it has to be 90 degrees in anticipation. In other words, if you want to go forward that way, you pull it on this side, and you can say due to gyroscopic effect, the flywheel tips then that way. And that in turn makes the blades go that way. In other words, the rotor will tip forward and pull the machine forward.
Test flights were entirely satisfactory. It was time now to go full scale. In September 1941, Arthur Young packed his model in a suitcase and went to see the Bell Aircraft Corporation. Larry Bell must have been impressed because Arthur got a deal and a place to work. The Bell helicopter was on the way.
Well, at first it seemed tempting to try all kinds of new things, and the chief design engineer whose office I was in had various ideas about how it should be done. And I found these ideas impractical and eventually just used the model itself, scaled up 6 times to make the full scale.
The Bell factory was located at Buffalo, New York, and in June 1942, Arthur set up his own specialized unit in a garage a few miles away at Gardenville. He wanted to build a full-scale helicopter.
But then when I read the fine print, it was to draw 2 helicopters, whereas my agreement was to make them. So I realized that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to draw. I didn't know how to draw them anyway. The thing was to make it, and when you found out how to make it, then you could draw it.
Arthur recruited some of Bell's best machinists, and his new team, known as the Gardenville Project, moved into action. In less than 6 months, the first task was complete, and in December 1942, Bell Model 30, known as Ship 1, was rolled out. Ship 1 had no clutch, so the crew had to spin the rotors to allow the engine to start. The stabilizer bar, Young's unique development, was now a permanent part of the design. In the first tests to find out how the controls responded, Ship 1 was tied down with a fixed landing gear of widely angled struts for stability. Arthur Young was the first pilot, and he made these tethered hops with the help of his old friend and assistant, Bart Kelly.
At the very early stages, we hadn't refined the rotor so that we had it perfectly balanced. And as it would get up to speed, it'd start shaking. And this was a very critical question. normally one could expect that it would clear up, you could go through resonance. In other words, after it shook for a while, then as you got to a higher speed, it would stop shaking and be all right. So I was determined to get through resonance, come hell or high water, and I gave it the gun, and it did go through resonance and sweetened up perfectly. This was before we were flying, of course. And then I sort of shut it off and wiped my brow. And at that moment, Bart comes rushing out, holding a piece of paper, saying, "Don't go through resonance, you'll blow up."
Another incident almost ended in tragedy. A Bell Company executive, who was also a test pilot, insisted he fly Ship 1. Arthur Young tried to discourage him, and when that failed, tried to explain the controls. But the executive wasn't interested.
In any case, he got into the thing and jiggled the controls around until it started bucking, and the tail went into the rotor and gave such a jolt to the thing that he was thrown through the rotor. I thought this was curtains, the end of everything. I rushed over to him because he was thrown out about 30 feet, but he was all right. He was just broken wrist, but he didn't bother us anymore.
The crash set the program back. Ship 1 had to be stripped down and reassembled, and a new set of rotors machined. The young man shaping these rotor blades out of solid wood had been trained by Arthur in the pre-Bell days to make rotor blades for the small-scale models, at a time when the need to replace broken rotors was an everyday event. Ship 1 featured a vertically mounted Franklin engine. It was a focal point the day rival helicopter pioneer Igor Sikorsky made his only visit to Gardenville.
There was a great flotilla of Cadillacs with all the Bell executives bringing Sikorsky, and they came to this little garage and all got out and sort of lined up on one side, and the other side was the Gardenville crew, and myself and Sikorsky facing one another. And Sikorsky said, "I see you have the vertical engine." And I said, "Yes, I have the vertical engine." And that was the conclusion of our visit.
Arthur designed his own test equipment. He set up a system using scales to measure the torque or twisting force at the tail of the helicopter. Knowing this figure and the RPM of the Franklin engine, an exact calculation of engine power was possible. Franklin claimed 160 horsepower.
We could get very accurate figures on horsepower, and this was embarrassing to Franklin because we could never get the power that they claimed we could get from the engine. See, this way I could measure the power without any doubt about it.
The full-scale helicopter in tethered hover showed the same stability as the small model. In June 1943, Ship 1 was ready to be tested in forward flight. The only convenient place was a small grassy meadow outside the Gardenville building. Pilot Floyd Carlson found that under speeds of 20 miles an hour, it performed well. But when he attempted higher speeds, an old problem reappeared in a different form.
We had trouble with what we call 2 per rev. That's a vibration that sets in as you get going about 30 miles an hour. And in the conservative flying I'd done, I'd not run into it. But when Floyd started to go faster, he ran into this severe vibration. And we had to solve that, which we did by stiffening the rotor.
But it wasn't that simple. The problem needed experimentation. And rather than experiment with Ship 1, Arthur Young pressed one of his old models back into service. A solution was eventually suggested by Floyd Carlson. He proposed a system of bracing the rotor blades, which you can see at the top of the mast. In honor of his Swedish ancestry, it was named the Swedish Yoke, and it did the job perfectly. The first free flights in this form, in the large space of a Buffalo airfield, were an immediate success.
He took off and was immediately flying over 70 miles an hour with no trouble at all. We didn't have room for passenger, but we gave the dog a ride. And actually, at one point, the wheel fell off. But there was no problem because I just stuck the wheel in like a caster while he hovered. Yes, that was a famous day.
After this success, Ship 1 emerged with a complete skin and a new paint job. It was now a fully fledged helicopter, the pride of the Gardenville project. The next test was to be a power-off landing under auto-rotation. This was the second with a mild flare or nose-up attitude. Then came the third.
So he flared even more, which meant that the ship landed at a 45-degree angle and then smashed down on the front. And it all ground up in itself, and then we were amazed to see Floyd just climb out. And someone said, are you all right? And he said, yes, God damn it.
Arthur Young on the right looks at the damage, and the unscathed Floyd Carlson suggests a modification to the landing gear to prevent a repeat of the accident. Ship 1 will have to be rebuilt. September 1943. A new helicopter emerges from the Gardenville garage. This is Ship 2 with its enclosed cockpit. It was designed to have a family resemblance to the Bell Company's World War II fighter, the Aero Cobra. The only passengers to fly in Ship 1 had been Arthur Young's dog Brian and a bag of cement. Larry Bell, the company president, had still not flown. Now he was to get his chance. His first vertical ascent would be in Ship 2.
And that had a seat wide enough for two persons. And that was the one that Larry had his ride in. I think it was March 1944.
According to Bartram Kelly, Larry's reaction to his ride was that as an old farm boy, it allowed him to look at cows from an entirely new angle. There were many visitors to Gardenville, anxious to see and even touch this new marvel. Among them was a group of Russian generals.
And these generals were looking at it, and one of them in particular kept reaching in and turning knobs and things. And I said, no, mustn't do that. But he kept on doing it, so I slapped his wrist, and then he stopped. So I have the distinction of having slapped the Russian general's wrist.
Model 30 Ship 2 was a thoroughly practical, maneuverable helicopter, except that the two-seater space was somewhat cramped. It would have appeared much earlier, but Bell's insistence on the cosmetic similarity to the Aero Cobra had slowed production down. But now, in the spring of 1944, with Ship 1 repaired and displaying a splendid yellow color scheme, it appeared that Arthur Young had fulfilled the terms of his agreement with Larry Bell to build two helicopters. And now it was time to put these machines before the public. These were still the very early days of helicopter flight, and there were records to be broken. This is the Armory in Buffalo on May 10, 1944. Floyd Carlson puts on a show for the officers and cadets of the Civil Air Patrol, and in the process makes the first indoor helicopter flight in the Western Hemisphere. His only problem is coping with the blinding glare of the spotlight. July 4th the same year, Ship 1 is the star of the show in front of a crowd of 42,000 at the Buffalo Civil Stadium. Again, Floyd Carlson is the pilot, and for most of these people, seeing for the first time a helicopter going through its bag of tricks, this is a rare glimpse of the future. But back at the Bell factory, Larry Bell's engineers, having learned some lessons from Arthur Young's project, were designing their own helicopter, Model 42. It was built like an airplane, with room for 4 passengers, but it would never go into production. Meanwhile, Arthur Young was building another helicopter, but it was not exactly authorized, and Bell management wasn't aware it was being built. This rare film shows how little attention was given to aesthetic appearance, but by now the Gardenville project knew what worked and what didn't. Ship 3 was a real helicopter, using all the best features of Ships 1 and 2. It became the basis of the Bell 47, America's first civil helicopter.
Well, we did get a windshield in the form of this bubble, which was dreamed up by a friend of mine who came. I'd known him socially before I went to Bell, Joe Parrish. He had the idea of taking a sheet of plexiglass, heating it in the furnace, laying it on a flat table, and then putting a template over it to confine the shape, and blowing with compressed air just the way you'd blow a soap bubble.
The Bell 47 would appear in many different versions, but the bubble became its signature. For Arthur Young, the arrival of the 47 meant the end of his association with helicopters.
The 47 was about to be a production model. We had the drawings all finished, and the production line was started, and they were beginning to come off the line. So I thought my task was done.
But the man who had begun working with model helicopters in 1931 had another reason for leaving this phase of his career. Arthur Young was fascinated by pure science and the study of philosophy. In August 1945, the world was changed forever by a single event. The nuclear age had arrived.
And this reminded me that I didn't want to go on wasting my time making machinery. It was fun to make machinery, but there were more important things. And as I put it to myself at the time, we needed a mental A-bomb, something that would enlarge our horizons as the physical bomb had enlarged mechanical horizons. That's what I spent the rest of my life on.
And while Arthur Young went off to pursue his philosophy for the post-nuclear age, the Bell 47, in its many different forms, military and civil, flew into history. The Boeing Berthold Chinook, the Western world's standard medium-lift helicopter for almost 30 years, immediately recognizable with its two rotors, one in front and one at the rear, the classic tandem arrangement. The world's first helicopter designed specifically for lift was also a tandem rotor design. The forefather of the Chinook, the Piasecki HRP-1, was better known as the Flying Banana. The prototype first flew in 1947 in Philadelphia, the home of helicopter pioneer Frank Piasecki.
Philadelphia was sort of a center of rotary-wing activity. And it was mainly because the Pitcairn family, Harold Pitcairn in particular, brought the Sierra patents from the British Sierra Company to the U.S. and set up a company in Willow Grove to manufacture autogyros.
For a young engineer, 1930s Philadelphia was an exciting town. Other rotorcraft manufacturers had followed Pitcairn's lead and set up factories there. Frank Piasecki took a ride in an autogyro and was hooked. He graduated in aeronautical engineering and went to work at the Platt-LePage Aircraft Corporation, manufacturers of the XR-1, America's first military helicopter. But Frank wasn't fulfilled by his job at Platt-LePage. With a group of young engineers, he built his own helicopter, the PV-2. By April 1943, the aircraft was ready to fly.
There were very few experienced pilots. There were about 7 people, Lou Levitt being one amongst them, and he wasn't available. And so when we thought it over, including the prices, we decided it was me who was going to be the pilot.
As a pilot, Frank Piasecki only had 14 hours of fixed-wing flying time. He had to teach himself to fly the PV-2. Frank was the son of Polish immigrants. When the day of the first flight came, he used the only available open space, the local Polish picnic ground. In spite of some tricky moments, the first flights were encouraging enough to warrant the PV-2 being fitted with a complete skin. In its new streamlined form, it was rolled out for a continuing series of test flights. The PV-2, with its dynamically balanced rotor blades and full cyclic pitch control, was seen by Piasecki as a technology demonstrator. As the designer and the pilot, he was in a perfect position to get it right.
And it was a sweetheart. It could do anything. It was very controllable machine.
The PV-2 was only the second American helicopter to be demonstrated in public, but Frank Piasecki had another audience in mind. He showed the PV-2 to the Navy and tried to interest them in a large transport helicopter. He had some definite ideas about a new approach.
We said we would be absolutely honest to ourselves as to the estimates of weight and structural strength and all of the things required, so that we wouldn't come out with an absolute answer, but we would come out with a relative answer to each of the designs. And the tandem, no matter how we did it, no matter who did it, in this comparison and calculations, the tandem always came out better. And the reason for it became fairly obvious. One, all of your power is going into lift, because the rotor, the counteracting the torque, was automatic by the fact that the two rotors turn in opposite directions. So that was fundamental.
But the Navy wasn't interested, and Piasecki took the idea to the Coast Guard. On New Year's Day 1944, he signed a contract with the Coast Guard to build an experimental helicopter. The first Piasecki tandem helicopter had the designation XH-RPX, but to the Piasecki Company, it was known as the Dog Ship. The rotors of the Dog Ship had a diameter of 41 feet, and the fuselage was 48 feet long. It was designed to cruise at almost 100 miles an hour and to carry a load that was unheard of for helicopters.
So our effective useful load of 1,900 pounds in those days was roughly 3 times the size of anything that was flying at that time.
At the time, the Dog Ship was the world's largest helicopter. It could carry 2 crew and 10 passengers. It was powered by one Continental R975 engine, developing 450 horsepower. That engine drove both sets of rotors. Weight was crucial, and when the Dog Ship finally got a skin, it was made from the lightest available material, balloon cloth. The Dog Ship was not a prototype. It was seen as a flying mock-up. This way it was possible to measure its flight and control characteristics, with a view to improving them when the prototype was built. The Dog Ship could also be used for demonstration to prospective buyers. The Navy was now convinced, and it ordered 2 prototypes, designated HRP-1, for further testing. They had Pratt & Whitney R1340 radial engines of 600 horsepower. Like the Dog Ship, the prototype HRP-1s flew without a skin, and their performance was impressive enough for the Navy to place an order in June 1946 for 10 production models. Later, they ordered another 10. When the HRP-1 went into service in June 1947, the bent fuselage shape immediately created interest. From then on, it was stuck with the name Flying Banana.
People didn't realize why that shape was, but it was because you had to have clearance in the middle of the fuselage for the rotor blade flapping. And of course, as you flew forward and you tilted the machine, the front part of the machine was level, and the rear part was up as a rear pylon.
In 1945, the U.S. Navy issued requirements for a compact utility and rescue helicopter to operate at sea. This Piasecki design, the HUP-1, made its first flight in October 1948. It won the naval competition against a Sikorsky single rotor design and went into service in 1949. The overlapping rotors gave it an advantage in the cramped space of small aircraft carriers.
This made it possible for the design to be brought up into the carrier elevator, the rear rotor unlocked and phased properly so that its blades were in the proper corners and the front rotor in the proper corners, and then dropped immediately without any folding of the blades, which made a tremendous time advantage to the overlap tandem.
But the overlapping rotors produced more downwash than single rotor helicopters,
because the downwash of one rotor added to the downwash of the other. So you had a bigger downwash in the center, but we had enough blade area and enough power, and we were so much more efficient than the single rotor that didn't really bother us.
339 Piasecki Hup helicopters were built, and they gave 20 years of service to military forces in the U.S., Canada, and France. The HRP-2 was an improved version of the original HRP-1 Flying Banana. The pilot now sat forward of the front rotor, and the helicopter was given a metal skin. Its successor, the H-21 Workhorse, was designed at the height of the Cold War as a high-altitude rescue helicopter, able to pick up returning bomber crews if they went down in the mountains of Alaska. It was a challenge to any new pilot.
We found that when the pilot made a hovering turn, he made it about himself. And he became the center of the turn, and the rest of the machine went all around him. You could, if you forced yourself as a pilot, rotate the machine exactly on its center of gravity. But that meant that you were flying sideways with the tip of the machine, with the end of the machine, and so you were going laterally and around in a circle yourself, which wasn't exactly what a pilot likes to do.
The Workhorse was given a larger engine and rotor system to cope with the possibility of rescues at high altitude. Two massive drive shafts connected the 1,425 horsepower engine to the front and rear rotors. The rotor diameter was now 44 feet, and drive shaft maintenance was crucial to the safety of these large tandem helicopters. The H-21 lived up to its name. It was a real workhorse, able to operate in a variety of configurations and perform many different jobs. In 1955, the H-21 was adapted for testing in quite a new role.
And because of its size and weight and capacity of about 13,000 pounds gross weight, it was used as the test bed to mount the machine guns down at Fort Rucker. And I was there when they were mounting a 50 caliber machine gun on the front landing gear, because it was expeditious to do that.
This H-21 bristled with guns in almost every possible location. The Workhorse became the first helicopter to go into service with 50 caliber machine guns when the French used them as gun platforms in Algeria. But its major war service took place in Vietnam in the early years of American non-combat support to the South Vietnamese Army from 1961 to 1963. When the Piasecki H-16 made its first flight on October 23, 1953, it was the largest helicopter in the world. Its rotor diameter was 82 feet, almost twice that of the H-21 Workhorse. Powering this monster was a design challenge.
It was originally with two piston engines, one at each end of the aircraft, in their own engine rooms. It was quite interesting how everybody was enhanced by the fact that here was a helicopter that had an engine room.
The huge overlapping rotors were made of aluminum skin with a honeycomb composite filling. The H-16's fuselage had the capacity of a 4-engined airliner and could lift up to 14,000 pounds.
We later on, in the second model, went to turbines, and we had 2 turbines driving the machine. It was very successful. It had 82-foot diameter rotors, but the RPM was so slow that any vibratory motion from the rotors, which were 3-bladed, would come in almost as a loping action. And you could actually almost see the rotor blades turning. You could actually watch the blade as it turned around.
The turbine engines chosen for the YH-16A were Allison T-38 turboshafts, each delivering 1,800 horsepower. The helicopter in this turbine-powered form first flew in 1955. In this form, the YH-16A was known as the Turbo Transporter. In 1955, Frank Piasecki left the company. It was renamed Vertol. Piasecki formed a new company, the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation. In early 1956, the YH-16A set an unofficial world speed record of 166 miles an hour, but shortly after, a test equipment failure caused it to crash, and hopes for a promising future were destroyed. This is the Bristol 192 Belvadier, a turbine-powered tandem rotor helicopter from England. The original piston-engined model was designed in the late 1940s using Frank Piasecki's concepts. The prototype made its first flight in 1952. Civilian airline trials were conducted in 1956, but no commercial orders were received. Because of an accident, the civilian test version was taken out of service. The turbine-powered 192 made its first flight on July 5, 1958. 26 were produced for the British Royal Air Force. They went into service in late 1961. They were used briefly in service in Southeast Asia during the Indonesian confrontation crisis in the early 1960s. The Belvadier had 2 Rolls-Royce Napier Gazelle turbine engines of 1,650 horsepower. The rotors had a diameter of 48 feet. The Belvadier could carry 19 fully equipped troops or lift 6,000 pounds of cargo, either packed internally or slung underneath. Its maximum speed was 138 miles an hour, and it had a range of 437 miles. The Belvadier remained in service with the Air Force until 1969. Meanwhile, in America, Frank Piasecki, the man who originated the tandem rotor concept, was turning his attention to other forms of rotorcraft.
Well, we did not want to be in competition with our own designs, and so we said, okay, let's not do anything with a tandem because that's been fairly well established, and so let's not fight against ourselves.
Having left the big tandem helicopter behind, Piasecki turned his attention to exploring designs for radical forms of rotorcraft. This is the prototype of the Flying Jeep Skycar, or Air Jeep. It was the winner of an Army competition for a vehicle that was invisible to radar because of its ability to follow the contours of the Earth and remain under the radar signal. It made its first flight in September 1958, with Frank Piasecki at the controls. Lift, propulsion, and control all came from the ducted rotors. The pitch of each one could be changed independently, so the front or the rear could be lifted. A combination of cyclic pitch and vanes on the rotors gave directional control. The test program examined its potential as a stealthy weapons-carrying system.
The Jeep was designed to fly under the trees, just feet off the ground and under the foliage.
The next stage was a turbine-powered version, with the rotors mounted on an angle, but the project was shelved in the early 60s. By 1960, Piasecki's old company had been taken over by Boeing and became Boeing Vertol. It was heavily involved in the development of a new medium-lift tandem helicopter for the United States Army. That helicopter was designated CH-47, but it would become known worldwide as the Chinook. It couldn't have come at a better time. America was already involved in Vietnam, and the Piasecki H21 stationed there were showing their age. When the Chinook arrived in Vietnam in 1965, it had a huge and immediate impact. (1962). At the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation, another of Frank Piasecki's innovative ideas was being tested. He'd been working on the design of a ducted fan, which could be fitted to the rear of a small single-rotor helicopter. The idea was to increase its speed in level flight. Testbed was the 16H1 Pathfinder, Piasecki's first single main-rotor helicopter since the early PV-2. The fan system wasn't only used for forward speed. The helicopter's foot pedals operated vanes in the ringtail, as the fan was called, to counteract torque and give directional control. The next test bed was the 16H1A Pathfinder II. Modifications had been sponsored by the Army and Navy, and its goal was speeds up to 230 miles an hour. It was a compound helicopter with a small wing to take the load off the rotor in forward flight. In tests, it showed off its extreme maneuverability. The Pathfinder II almost succeeded in reaching its speed target in level flight. It flew at 225 miles an hour. While the Pathfinder never went into production, the idea of the ringtail ducted fan system is still well and truly alive. Germany in the late 1930s. World War II had not yet begun, but already, in the vertical flight race, the German Reich was ahead. The Fokker-Achilles FW-61 held every world helicopter record. The test pilot, Hanne Reich, had shown the FW-61 to the German public. The rest of the world also watched. But when war broke out in 1939, information stopped. For American helicopter pioneers, there was only silence from Germany.
The first really successful flights were made around 1937 by Fokker in Germany. They were followed by other flights. However, during the recent years, we had no news from Germany, and we do not know of any further success of these outstanding pioneer designs.
But behind the silence, there had been further development, a great deal of it. One of the most successful German designers was Anton Flettner. In 1942, the Flettner Colibri became the world's first military helicopter. Only 22 were built for operation with the German Navy. They were used for reconnaissance, flying from platforms above the gun turrets of convoy escort ships. They had a reputation as hardy, reliable, and practical machines. The Fokker-Achilles 223 Drak, or Dragon, used the same side-by-side layout as the record-breaking FA-61. It made its first flight in August 1940. It was much larger than the FA-61 and was capable of lifting 2,000 pounds. It had the amazing maximum speed for that time of 115 miles an hour. Some had a machine gun fitted for self-defense. It was used by the Luftwaffe for transport, supply, and reconnaissance. At the other end of the size spectrum was the unpowered Fock-Achilles FA-330. It was a one-man automotive kite designed for towing behind U-boats for observation. A telephone line was embedded in a 500-foot towing cable for communication between pilot and U-boat. The Doppelhoff WN-342 was another small observation helicopter, the first to be powered by jets on the rotor blade tips. 4 prototypes were built, but it never entered production. Because of high fuel consumption in the tip jets, later versions only used them for takeoff and landing, and it flew as an autogyro in level flight. When the Allies entered Germany at the end of the war, they found among other helicopters 3 Flettner Colibris in perfect working order. 1 went to Russia, and the other 2 were taken back to the United States, where they went through a comprehensive test and evaluation program. This rare post-war American film shows the excellent stability and control characteristics that surprised American helicopter designers. In the war years, the American helicopter industry had itself come of age. This is the Sikorsky XR-4. On May 6, 1943, it landed safely in a cleared space on the cargo deck of the tanker Bunker Hill. It was America's first helicopter shipboard landing. The XR-4 was not the military's first choice to launch the U.S. Army into the helicopter age. It had been rejected in favor of a helicopter rather like the German FA-61 in basic layout. The Platt-Lepage had side-by-side rotors and a fuselage like an airplane. But Igor Sikorsky was not a man to take rejection lying down.
Sikorsky Aircraft, which lost a design competition on paper, decided that now was the time to go ahead full steam with the concept of the helicopter. So largely with private financing, with the support of then United Aircraft, today it's United Technologies, the decision was made to build the helicopter independent of government orders.
The Platt-Lepage's similarity to the German FW-61 was not accidental. In the 1930s, W. Lawrence Lepage had visited Germany and been impressed by the German approach to rotorcraft design. The XR-1 made its first flight in May 1941. It was found to have a weak airframe, which slowed down the testing process. But in any case, it was never to become a satisfactory operational machine. The Army's original decision to choose the XR-1 had been based on caution.
And they proposed the same low-risk solution that had already been demonstrated in Germany, that is by Professor Fokker, the 2 rotors side by side. As a backup, that was the XR-1. And then the XR-2 and the XR-3 were autogyros, low-risk fallback decisions. And then as the VS-300 began to prove itself, and began to demonstrate very desirable flying characteristics, a last contract for the XR-4 was let to Sikorsky Aircraft. Basically, at first, it was a contract to build a much larger 2-seater version of the VS-300 machine. And that eventually evolved, however, into the XR-4.
The XR-4's delivery flight from Stratford, Connecticut to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, established an American helicopter distance record. When it was officially handed over to the Army on May 18, 1942, it was ready to go into service. Present at the handing over ceremony was one of America's greatest aviation pioneers, Orville Wright. In April 1944, a Sikorsky YR-4 rescued an American pilot and 3 British casualties from behind enemy lines in the Burmese jungle. They had to be taken out one at a time. It was one of the Sikorsky R-4's most remarkable actions of the war, and a pointer to the helicopter's future as an effective military tool. Even before World War II was over, people were thinking about the new life peacetime would bring. The idea of the family helicopter seemed a possibility. The man tipping the car park attendant in this promotional film is Sikorsky test pilot Les Morris, and the helicopter is the Sikorsky test bed, the VS-300. Boundless possibilities for future use of the helicopter were in Igor Sikorsky's mind almost before it was off the drawing board.
We can visualize the helicopter being used for carrying mail, passengers, freight. We can further expect its extensive use for all kinds of emergencies, such as forest control, health, or medical assistance. And finally, we can expect its development for private use. One could hazard the hypothesis that our ways of life would be changed just as they were when the automobile came into general use.
But the idea of rotorcraft for the average family was not new. In the mid-1930s, the Pitcairn Company had suggested the possibility that there could be an autogyro in every garage, even if the rotors might not quite fit through the garage door. Any autogyro could land, but only the Pitcairn AC-35 could land, have its rotors folded, and then drive away on a public road, just like an automobile. This wasn't a fantasy. The AC-35 was actually approved for road use. But the helicopter designers took the 1930s possibilities one step further. Frank Piasecki, in his first helicopter, the PV-2, promoted his product with the idea that you could land at the gas station and fill up if your tank was getting low. And if that didn't stretch your imagination, think of the reaction of other golfers when you casually landed on a golf course and left your brand new helicopter next to a green while you went off to shoot 18 holes. But when the war came to an end, it wasn't all sweetness and light in the helicopter industry.
Well, see, this was after the war, so there was just no military deep interest, no military programs, where the nation was in a closed-down mode.
In the absence of orders from the military, Charles Command went out of his way to interest the general public in the helicopter. He staged regular demonstrations outside his factory, showing off the helicopter's bag of tricks to a willing audience.
We were going to build a helicopter for commercial use for every man to fly because it would be that easy. And we had the vision that the sky would be black with them. Kids are entitled to dream. That moves the world. And we were kids dreaming.
If the kids were dreaming, so were the business executives. But there was more chance of the helicopter being adopted by corporate leaders than the average suburban household. Nevertheless, the American public was more than happy to watch the spectacular barnstorming publicity events staged all over the country by the energetic helicopter manufacturers. Indoor flights and 4th of July exhibitions attracted thousands of willing spectators who embraced this new phenomenon as a symbol of American ingenuity. Ingenuity that would take them into a new life after the trials of wartime were forgotten. The Bell Company staged these events, and Sikorsky did the same. And even the very small manufacturers tried to join the drive to capture the imagination of the ordinary American. Stanley Hiller Jr. was just 17 in 1942 when he started to build his first helicopter. By the time he was 19, it was finished, and he flew it for the first time in the University of California Stadium on May 14, 1944. Hiller's coaxial rotor system was extremely effective, giving stability and simplicity of operation. Hiller believed strongly in the idea of a helicopter in every garage, and developed a number of other models, including one called the Commuter. Hiller also produced a conventional single-rotor helicopter using his rotormatic system for rotor stability. It also used an overhead lever control instead of the usual cyclic stick between the pilot's knees. This helicopter was to go into production as the immensely successful Hiller Model 360. At a time when families were looking to escape the city centers and settle in the space and peace of the countryside, the helicopter seemed to be the ideal daily commuter vehicle. The Kellett XR-8 was produced by the Kellett Autogyro Company. It was America's first helicopter to use the side-by-side intermeshing rotor system. But the dream of personal helicopter transport was never to become fact. Dr. Bob Rosen of NASA.
Kind of picture we all heard about from popular mechanics in the 40s and early 50s of everybody having one of these things in their garage and commuting to work is something that's not going to happen. And when I think of the difficulty of traffic patterns now and think about everybody commuting in a rotorcraft to work, I'll tell you, if there's one, I'm not going to be doing that no matter what else happens with all those people in the sky.
But if the everyman helicopter was just a fantasy, there were more than enough real commercial applications just waiting to be recognized. In post-war America, helicopter manufacturers were confronted by stark economic reality.
The regulations to get a type certificate so that we could sell them had been severely increased so that we needed a lot of money. So began there the first of a series of endless compromises. The first was we'd better give up the idea of every man's helicopter and build a crop duster.
Back in the 30s, the Autogyro had been recognized as a useful machine for crop dusting. But while the Autogyro's rotors helped distribute sprays more thoroughly than ground equipment could, the helicopter went one better. Its positive downwash forced sprays around and under the plants in a way never before possible. It was a spectacular sight for any onlookers, and in those days, nobody worried about the health risks. Helicopters had other advantages over the established forms of crop spraying. Ground machinery was slow, could damage the crops, and could only work when ground conditions allowed. Fixed-wing aircraft were fast, but that was half their problem. Speed made them dangerous in confined spaces. The helicopter's ability to control its speed in the air from 0 to somewhere approaching 100 miles an hour gave it a flexibility no other vehicle had. Helicopters were also highly maneuverable and were able to adjust to the details of the ground surface for the greatest effect. The military was no longer the sole target of helicopter manufacturers. They recognized a huge civilian market potential. The task was to identify a need and then sell the helicopter as an answer. On March 8, 1946, this Bell 47 received the first American type certificate for a commercial helicopter. Newspapers, which had used autogyros since the 30s, were quick to see the helicopter as a faster way of getting reporters and photographers out to a story and back again. Helicopters could land on a roof or in a car park. Film could be processed quickly, and the photographs could be on the streets in the evening edition, while surface-bound reporters were still fighting traffic jams. The helicopter found a role in animal conservation. In rugged, inaccessible territory, it could monitor species numbers, or if necessary, herd the animals to a new location. Within a year of coming into service, the Bell 47 was being used in the oil fields in Louisiana. Its value for geophysical surveys and for transporting personnel to difficult locations was immediately recognized, and soon helicopters were a common sight in oil fields all around the world. But the helicopter really came into its own on offshore oil rigs. In 1948, a Bell 47 made the first helicopter landing on a rig 19 miles out to sea in the Gulf of Mexico. Soon, helicopter manufacture became an international industry. In December 1946, the British Westland Company acquired the rights to produce and sell Sikorsky helicopters throughout the world except the North American continent. Westland was free to develop and improve the basic Sikorsky models, and their version of the S51, the Dragonfly, went into service in October 1948. It had a larger engine, higher speed, and longer range than the Sikorsky original. It earned a reputation as an extremely effective rescue helicopter. By the 1950s, the Westland Company had established a strong identity of its own, in spite of the unmistakable Sikorsky lines of its product. While Westlands followed the Sikorsky approach, the British Ferry Company was moving in its own direction. The Jet Gyrodyne was a convertiplane with tip jets and a pusher propeller. In December 1948, the British Sierra Company, famous for its autogyros, released the world's only three-rotor helicopter. It was called the Sierra Air Horse, but its suitability for large-scale crop dusting earned it the name Spraying Mantis. At the time, it was the largest helicopter in the world. The rotors all revolved in the same direction, but torque was canceled out by their triangular arrangement. British military Westland's Dragonflies served with the Royal Air Force in the Malayan jungles in the early 1950s. They were formed into the first British casualty evacuation unit. At about the same time, American helicopters began to perform the same service in Korea. Helicopter revolution was just beginning on the field of battle.
In the 1950s, the world became familiar with the military helicopter as a machine of mercy, an airborne ambulance that would whisk injured men from Korean battle zones to hospitals. A decade later, American fighting men returned to Asia, this time facing a much different type of war. Vietnam was a guerrilla war. The enemy would strike and then disappear. There was little doubt that the Army needed a faster mode of transportation to keep up with the enemy. Enter the Bell H21 Iroquois, fondly known as the Huey. This was no airborne ambulance, this was a fighting machine. Those that weren't used as troop transports were modified with 30-inch machine guns and rockets to escort the unarmed troop ships in and out of battle. The development of these helicopter gunships changed the nature of close air support. Helicopters were highly maneuverable, speedy, and could get down and dirty with the ground troops in a way that jets could not. The first Army Huey was the root of the American combat helicopter family tree. While one branch spawned an entire family of helos built specifically for transporting troops and supplies, another branch gave birth to the Cobra, the first pure attack helicopter. A worthy successor to its early gunship ancestors, the Cobra nonetheless had its Achilles heel.
With the Cobra, it had its primary anti-armor weapon was the tow missile, and it only had a range of 3,750 meters. That means in order to shoot a tank, you're getting close to being inside the tank's main gun round range.
The Army began looking ahead to the next generation of attack helicopters, and by 1975, they had two candidates. Bell Helicopters, the creator of the Huey Cobra, pitted its prototype AH-63 against the AH-64, made by rival manufacturer Hughes. After 850 hours of rigorous flight and ground trials, the Hughes AH-64 Apache emerged as the winner. 7 years of modification followed, including the acquisition of Hughes helicopter by aviation giant McDonnell Douglas. The first Apaches were delivered to the Army in early 1984. The Apache was easily the most formidable attack helicopter the world had ever seen. Imbued with all of the elusive, aggressive traits of its namesake tribe, the Apache was built to provide fire support to units in the field and to take out high-priority targets. More specifically, it was built to kill tanks. The Apache is a menacing aircraft, even stripped of its weaponry. In flight, it looks like the world's deadliest dragonfly. Its rugged exterior mirrors its durability.
Everything in this aircraft's designed to crash. If you were to get shot down or something like that, it's designed to if it crashes, it's designed for the crew to live. The 30 millimeter, it will jam up in between the front seat and the back seat. There's an actual space there for it to crush up into. The struts are designed to take a heck of a hard landing, and they're designed to crush all the way up, so the wheels would be up level with the pilot's head.
Armor, made of boron carbide bonded to Kevlar, shields the Apache crew and the helicopter's vital system. The protective layer surrounding the airframe and the crew seats can withstand the most small and medium anti-aircraft artillery. The blast shield between the two crew members guarantees that no single round will kill both pilots. Even the gas tanks on the Apache have their own defensive capability.
Basically what happens if a projectile goes through the fuel tank there's a gel in there. When it mixes with JP fuel, forms like a big glue, if you want to call it a glue, and it'll seal the hole. It'll basically seal the hole.
The muscle of the machine, twin General Electric engines, is shoulder-mounted on the fuselage behind the main rotor mast. The engines are physically separated and run independently, so if one takes a hit, the other can keep the Apache flying. The Apache's main rotor has 4 blades made up of stainless steel spars and glass fiber tubes. The blades can slice through tree branches up to 2 inches in diameter and can survive 50 caliber machine gun rounds and shell strike. With a top speed of close to 200 miles an hour, some pilots liken flying an Apache to driving an expensive sports car. Its controls are incredibly responsive to a pilot's every command. But speed, durability, and maneuverability alone are not enough. An Apache without firepower is like a gun without a bullet. The Army designed the Apache as a platform for a new generation of weapons. One is the laser-guided Hellfire air-to-ground missile. The Hellfire can pierce the armor of any known battle tank from more than 3.5 miles away.
What it does basically is we designate targets on the battlefield with our laser, with a coded laser. The missile, before it leaves the rail, knows our laser code. When we squeeze the missile off, it finds a laser beam, it rides, so to speak, that laser beam to the target.
Hellfires are ounce for ounce more expensive than gold. The Apache can carry up to 16 Hellfires on its outboard rails, though a load of 8 is more typical. The accuracy and effectiveness of the weapon is unquestionable. The Hellfire is the premier anti-tank missile in the Army's inventory. It's what the military calls a standoff weapon. It inflicts maximum damage from a maximum distance. But when you're close enough to the enemy for a bare-knuckle brawl, hanging tight below the cockpit, the chain gun packs 1,200 rounds of 30mm punch. Two stud wings on either side of the Apache carry Hydra rockets. The 2.75-inch folding fin rockets can be armed with a wide variety of warheads.
We can use multiple purpose submunitions, which each rocket will carry 9 submunitions, and they burst in the air and they fall down and they'll cover a large area with small explosions. It's kind of a poor man's cluster bomb.
The Apache can launch its 38 rockets in a variety of combinations or all at once. That's a feeling pilots can only describe as a real rush.
And not only do you feel it, you smell it. You smell the fort as the 38 rockets leave the aircraft and the smoke that it leaves behind.
Strapping into an Apache is like climbing down into an Indy car. Not an inch of space is wasted in its sleek interior. The 2 crew members sit in tandem, with the pilot occupying the rear seat. His perch is more than a foot higher than the gunner's, providing a clear field of vision. While tasks are divided between the crew members, both are fully qualified pilots and both know how to operate the aircraft's weapons system. Stowed under the gunner's seat is a full set of flight control. But unless there's an emergency, he's focused on acquiring and destroying target. Not long ago, helicopter crews were virtually grounded once the sun went down. The surest way to wrap your helo around a tree was to fly at night. But for Apache pilots, nightfall is when the fun begins. As they slip on their high-tech helmets, another world emerges, a world where night becomes day.
Well, it was designed to fight and fly at night with an infrared system, and the pilots fly off a HTU. It's a little reticle that comes down over your eye. You can fight, fire, fly, all through that little TV screen.
There's a lot of information jammed into that little television screen. The pilot sees an infrared image that allows low-level map of the Earth flight, along with symbols that tell him how high and how fast he's flying. Maneuvering with one eye takes some practice. It's a skill pilots say that if you don't use, you lose. The helmet is connected by wires to the aircraft's weapons control system. Either crew member has the option of slaving the 30mm cannon to his helmet, so the gun automatically points wherever he looks.
It basically does a little trigonometry. It knows how high the helicopter is, what the look-down angle of your head is, and it does a little trigonometry and it figures out the range. If we were in a battle position, and the front seater is engaging targets, looking a long ways away, the back seater is worried about what's happening around him. So the back seater could have control of the gun, slave to his helmet. He could be looking to see if there's any bad guys around him and just suppression and keep them away while we're concentrating on what's going on downrange.
Because the Apache is a sexy, state-of-the-art machine, competition to fly it is fierce. Only the strong of mind, body, and spirit need apply. Potential pilots go through 9 months of basic flight school, and only then can request Apache duty. They undergo an additional 3 months of intense training. They log countless hours of flight time in simulators. The simulators are virtual reality that is virtually real. Pilots respond to one computer crisis after another to test their performance under pressure. While nothing can take the place of actual flight, the time spent here pays big dividends when the student straps on his first Apache. Once they graduate from flight school, pilots report to their operational units, but their schooling is never really finished. Skills need to be constantly fine-tuned, so the Apache pilot is totally prepared for the inevitable battle that lies ahead. The Apache received its trial by fire in December of 1989, during Operation Just Cause, the American invasion of Panama. A handful of Apaches, flying mostly at night, helped oust Panamanian strongman General Manuel Noriega from power. But the world would wait several more years before it heard the full battle cry of the Apache.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
Bam, got him. Shooting in a 6-1. Get your target, heading 1-0. Bam.
The coming weeks provided the Apaches a wealth of targets. They skimmed the desert floor at incredible speeds, night vision guiding them through the dark maze of battle to destroy skewers of Iraqi targets. Smoldering cinders of enemy bunkers and trucks provided grim proof of the lethality of the gunship's rockets and cannon fire. But most Apache pilots prefer the anonymity that comes with distance, a luxury that the Hellfire provides.
Is we'll have to pop up, find the target, get a range to it, come back down, shoot the missile will fly a pre-programmed trajectory over the hill, and we'll have a time of flight countdown. And as long as we pop up and we squeeze laser on the target for the last 8 seconds of flight, we'll be able to kill it.
Countless Iraqi tanks met their end without a clue of what hit them or where it came from. Though the Apache was successful in the open desert, the ideal battlefield for these pilots would provide a few more places to hide.
I was out in Saudi, you have nothing to hide behind. You feel like you're naked, basically. What we have is our standoff. With the Hellfire, we can stand off approximately 8 kilometers from the enemy. But that in itself, at times, if weather conditions are bad enough where you have to scoot in closer to the enemy, you tend to feel naked because you have nothing to hide behind. I would prefer to have hills, vegetation that I could put this aircraft behind and pop up, scan the battlefield, and I can videotape the battlefield, return to my mast, my safety, review my tape, and then prioritize my targets at that point, and then launch my Hellfire.
The future of the Apache has arrived in a variant called the Longbow. The Longbow looks just like a regular Apache, except for a knob on top of the main propeller mast. That knob contains millimeter wave radar, which enables the gunner to guide up to 16 missiles at a time. The radar is mounted high, allowing the helicopter to stay hidden while scanning the battlefield.
With the Longbow and the radar fire control, as long as the radar is exposed, it can find the targets and classify the targets and prioritize the targets, all without having to be exposed to the enemy. And they can shoot their radar-guided missiles, and they can get all the missiles going to a different target at one time.
As this new branch on the helicopter family tree continues to grow, no one knows which direction it will stretch. The only certainty is this: no enemy tank in the world today can ever feel safe with the Apaches on the prowl.
Amphibious assault. That's the environment for the Cobra gunship of the Marine Corps, the AH-1J and the AH-1T. The Cobras have a variety of missions throughout the amphibious operation. Escorting the transport helicopters during the ship-to-shore movement. Supporting their landings with suppressive fire. Escorting and scouting for marine armor ashore. Helping to control supporting arms. Marking targets and attacking enemy armor with a multitude of weapons. The AH-1J and T are virtually identical, except that the T is a tow Cobra, able to fire the tow missile. There are also minor differences in maneuvering ability. Cobras operate in two-plane sections wherever possible, for greater firepower and mutual protection. Maneuverability, agility, and small size make them difficult targets for enemy fire. This is an all-weather helicopter with IFR flight capability. It can operate at high altitudes if necessary, up to 10,000 feet. It's fast for a helicopter. Maximum speed in a dive with full ordnance load is 170 knots. The Cobra's prime operating area, however, is close to the deck where it's onto an enemy and past before he knows it's there. Cruise speed is 140 knots with a mission radius of 100 nautical miles. Visibility is unobstructed from the front seat, where the co-pilot usually rides. Both pilot and co-pilot are protected by armor plates and wear bulletproof vests. All Cobras carry 3-barrel 20mm Gatling guns with 750-round magazines. Rate of fire is 650 to 750 rounds per minute. This unusual weapon can be locked for the pilot to fire dead ahead, like a fighter plane. Or it can be trained, depressed, and elevated, fired from a remotely controlled turret by the co-pilot using a telescopic sight unit. The gun can be trained to 110 degrees either side of center. The wide angles of fire plus excellent crew visibility, giving the Cobra fast response to threats from any direction. It can be depressed 50 degrees and elevated 15 degrees. Along with the 20mm Gatling gun, there is a choice of other ordnance. The Cobra can carry up to 52 high-explosive and white phosphorus rockets in 4 pods, with 1 7-shot pod and 1 for 19 rockets on each side. The tow Cobra can substitute 4 tow missiles for one of the rocket pods on each side, carrying 8 tows in all. Other combinations are possible, depending on the demands of the mission. Here is some of the available ordnance. Gun pods, with additional Gatling guns firing forward only. Fuel air explosives, and flare canisters, each with 8 flares, fired in pairs. The Cobra carries a lot of firepower, but if it's loaded with everything it can hold, fuel quantity has to be reduced. Normal procedure is to carry enough fuel for the mission, plus an ordnance configuration tailored to the job at hand. The Cobra's versatility makes it an integral part of the amphibious assault, another weapon in the Marine arsenal. It becomes the eyes of the armored columns. It escorts and defends troop-carrying helicopters. It serves as a spotter for naval gunfire and artillery. It can mark targets for attack aircraft and control all types of close air support. Like all these systems, the Cobra exists to work with the ground troops. It is a tool of the landing force commander, assigned to the support of his units at any level, equipped for constant communication with command posts below, so that it can respond to changing needs as the situation develops. The Cobra's first mission in the amphibious assault is usually escort of helicopters carrying assault troops. At least 2 Cobras are normally used, deployed according to the expected threat and the terrain. In this case, the enemy threat is frontal, so the gunships lead the flight. The Cobras may fly behind if the threat is from the rear, as it often is on returning from the landing zone to the ships. If the enemy is believed to be a threat from all sides, the escorts may change their deployment constantly throughout the flight, but always in planned patterns. Station keeping and attention to schedules are vital during the ship-to-shore movement. The naval gunfire and supporting aircraft may be walking the flight if, laying down fires just ahead. Terrain is used wherever possible to mask the movement of the flight. The Cobras shift position as required by the terrain and by expected opposition. The escorts must be ready to drive off enemy helicopters, but must not leave the flight to pursue an enemy. The Cobras return any fire which could be a danger to the flight, but only long enough to distract the enemy from the transport. While the Cobras engage the enemy, the transports have a chance to get by without damage. At the landing zone, the lead Cobra pulls away from the flight and makes passes over the LZ to see if it's hot. The Cobra may fire 20mm shells or drop fuel air explosives to detonate booby traps and flush out defenders. As the transports approach, the gunships move to their second major task, support of the helicopter landings, with landing zone suppression fire. The troops and the transports are most vulnerable during offloading. The Cobras go into a protective pattern above the LZ, usually a butterfly, firing at any targets which could threaten the landing. The attack helicopters may break their pattern to respond to calls from the ground commander for strikes against specific targets around the LZ. The Cobra's job here is protection of the landing. They fly their protective patterns as long as the transports are on the ground, then normally escort them back to the beach unless the ground troops are in trouble and need their support. The return flight always takes a different route. If the area below is hot, supporting fires may walk the flight back to friendly territory. Again, the Cobras shift deployment as needed to guard against the most likely threat. The escort mission usually ends at the beach. Now, let's look at other Cobra missions as the amphibious assault proceeds. The Cobras pick up a Marine armored column. Escort and scouting for service convoys is another of their jobs. The attack helicopters have standard escort patterns for ground units, just as they do for transport helicopters. If the surface unit comes under enemy attack, Cobras respond with suppressive fire to allow the ground unit to get by, or to cover it as it turns back. The ground commander may ask the gunship to scout ahead of the convoy, conducting reconnaissance by observation or by fire. The Cobras often shoot into suspected defensive positions to draw fire and reveal the enemy. If an enemy position is discovered blocking a route of advance, the ground commander may ask the Cobras to search for an alternate, less well-defended attack route. The task here is to help the ground commander conduct his attack effectively. The Cobras become the eyes and ears of the armored column, expanding its field of view. The Cobra pilot can drop in on a ground commander to discuss a complex situation. This is called a Zippo brief. The ground commander has a set form for the brief. He is able to give the pilots only the information they need for the mission in organized fashion. In this case, the Cobra is to mark a target for jet attack. High-performance jets are unable to slow down to consult maps and pick out targets. A Cobra can sneak out of concealment nearby and mark the target with white phosphorus. Or he can stand off 4,000 meters and lob his Willie Feet rocket onto the target. And stay there to control the mission, advising the jet pilot by radio that the marker is on target for a specified distance off. The Cobra can coordinate supporting fires, popping up from concealment to observe a situation. Most Cobra pilots have completed schools for both artillery and naval gunfire coordination, and can also serve as forward air controllers. In addition to radio contact, Cobra pilots can land at artillery positions for first-hand planning or for passing on of missions. Even though this Cobra is coordinating supporting arms, it carries a variety of ordnance to be ready for any mission assigned. When a Cobra pops up from concealment, it may be for more than observation or control of supporting arms. It may be for direct attack on enemy armor. The tow Cobra can be a deadly killer. Two Cobras lie in wait. Their primary targets are anti-aircraft vehicles and tanks, then armored personnel carriers. One Cobra pops up. The other remains hidden. The lead Cobra pinpoints the target location after a quick look, and the co-pilot passes the information to his teammates. The second aircraft then pops up at a different location, and it fires. After firing, both Cobras take evasive action and move on to the next attack position. An attack on enemy armor may also involve two other Cobras further from the target to divert the enemy's attention and furnish protection for the attacking Cobras. An attack is often coordinated with diversionary raids by other supporting arms as well. Cobras begin to engage with tow when enemy armor gets within 3,000 meters or so of the FIBA, while the enemy is still occupied with other attacking elements. Stop him. Turn him around, or at the very least drive his troops out of the armored carriers and into the open, where they are slow and vulnerable. That's the object of a tow attack on enemy armor. Those are the tasks of the Cobra in an amphibious operation. Success depends on the aircraft's ability to operate from many types of amphibious ships, and on those ships maintaining a supply of parts and ordnance to support the Cobra missions. Many tasks depend on the Cobra's ability to operate after dark and in reduced visibility, with all aircraft IFR equipped and their pilots fully qualified. Cobra squadrons are ready for immediate deployment at any time, with aircraft, spare parts, ordnance, and all gear ready and marked for embarkation. Cobra squadrons spend about a third of their time aboard ships or at bases away from home. The squadron is in constant training to upgrade proficiency and combat readiness for both people and equipment. It's a long road to combat qualification for a Cobra pilot. It has to be to prepare him for the variety of tasks given to a Cobra squadron. The normal road runs directly from college to officer candidate school for 10 weeks. Then to basic school for 6 months or so of air and ground tactics. And on to flight school for a year to 18 months, first in fixed-wing aircraft and then in helicopters. When he gets his wings, he has about 200 hours of flight time, and he's been in school and training for at least 2 years, without counting college time. When the new pilot reports to his squadron, he's usually looking at still another year of training to be combat qualified. On escort duty, scouting for an armored column, working with high-performance jets, attacking enemy armor on its own, the Cobra has carved its own niche in the arsenal for amphibious assault. Today, it is an almost indispensable weapon to the Marine Corps.
The title of this film may be a little misleading, because to most of you, the AH-1S turret and rocket management doesn't represent the introduction of a new system. Rather, it is a system refinement based on Cobra weapons with which you're already partially familiar. The Chin turret system is a case in point. It has an M197 20mm gun with a capability rate of fire limited to 750 shots per minute on the AH-1S Series 50 ammunition. The turret is electrically driven in azimuth and in elevation. Direct drive DC motors through a gear train supply mechanical power for driving the turret. The servo amplifiers are in the Universal Turret Control Assembly, located on the right side of the aircraft at the gunner station. Positioning of the weapon is by means of the familiar helmet sight. It makes gun control virtually instinctive. By selection where the pilot or gunner looks, there the gun will point automatically. The gun moves left or right in azimuth 110 degrees, a total of 220 degrees. The normal slew rate is more than 80 degrees a second. In elevation, it varies from 11 degrees to 21 degrees up and 50 degrees down. With such rapid turret traverse, be sure when the gun turret is energized that the area is secured. This will prevent someone being accidentally struck by the gun should the turret be rotated. If there is a loss of any electrical power or master arm is turned off, the turret will go to emergency stow position 11 degrees up and 0 degrees azimuth. During ground maintenance operation of turret, the emergency stow circuit breaker should be pulled to prevent the emergency stow from activating. Here's the gun feed system. It is a proven design, classic in its simplicity. Note the similarities between the 7.62 gun feed system on the original AH-1G more than a dozen years ago and the 20mm feed system on your new AH-1S. Conceptually, they are similar systems, but there are many refinements. Here's a small but important example. By activating the loading switch, this electric motor pulls the linked 20mm rounds from the box and pushes them into the section of flexible chute that connects to the gun feeder. This booster motor eliminates the excessive belt pull loads that would be found if the delinking feeder were the only source of power. The booster motor also eliminates the need to manually fill the chute during loading operations. Although this turret is a growth version of the proven M28 turret, the 20mm M197 weapon provides vastly improved combat punch when compared to the 7.62 round. This is test footage of the gun system taken during its qualification at Yuma. But this gun system has been through more than just an extensive Army test program. It is the same weapon which has been in operational use with the Marines on their AH-1Js. So it's a proven system, one which should enter the Army inventory with minimum growth pains. Recoil is obviously a problem with any 20mm cannon. You'll notice this single recoil adapter located above the gun drive assembly. There's also a compensation circuit running to the aircraft's SCAS system. This means that appropriate aircraft attitude changes are made through the SCAS whenever the gun is fired. Which leads us to another electronic compensation. It's the way the gun takes its own Kentucky windage, the automatic corrections for aircraft speed and gun attitude. These small sighting corrections are automatically fed to the gun as a target is being tracked throughout the 220-degree field of fire. Turret system test and checkout is a simple routine operation. This single test set will check out the entire system. W1 connects to the aircraft power source. W6 is a multiple lead cable that connects to the gun control assembly through the fairing access door and to the logic control unit and test connector 19J1. Now you're ready for an operational check of the turret system. Use of the test set is detailed in TM-9-1090-206-12, but we'll just briefly look at some of the functions. There are several important safety considerations before starting a system checkout. All wing stores should be downloaded. W3J1 should be disconnected from W2P1. The gun, feeder, and feed system should be clear of ammunition. In short, no ordnance should be on the aircraft. These are all common sense procedures, but they must be done in sequence, so just follow your TM checklist, and you'll soon be ready to begin the operational check of all turret systems. You'll find operation of the test set straightforward. There are 16 keys for test selection and command functions, plus reticle, pass, and fail indicators. There are 9 separate functional checks, the first being power distribution and test set connection, followed by a test for fixed forward servo stability. There is a check to verify the gunner's turret stow position. There are 3 TSU tests: tracking, turret depression limits, and a tracking out of coincidence check. Slow turret slew and forcing function are covered in the next test. And the last 2 tests verify gun trigger application and release. When a fail condition exists, there are fault code numbers displayed on the test set. These numbers and the fault code table in the TM will help to diagnose the malfunction in the system. This has been a quick overview of the M197 Universal Turret. You may well ask why call it universal when all we've shown is the 20mm M197 gun. Well, it does accept other weapons. The M134, for example, the proven Cobra minigun, 7.62mm. And perhaps most important of all, growth capability is designed into the turret. So if future tactical needs dictate even larger caliber than 20mm, the system is designed to accept the M230E1 30mm chain gun. Now let's take a look at the rocket management system. Wing stores have been important since the first attack helicopter, and although the stores might not look too different than other Cobra versions, there is a significant difference in capability. This control and display unit is the heart of rocket management. It permits the pilot to select the precise rockets needed for specific mission requirements. We'll use animation to show the relationship between the zones of the display unit and the specific rocket tubes which they control. Zone 1 is the outer ring of rocket tubes on the outboard launchers, a total of 24. Zone 2 contains the top and bottom pair on the inner rings of tubes, again, the outboard launchers. This is a total of 8. Zone 3 is similar to Zone 1, the outer ring of tubes, only this time on the inboard launchers, again a total of 24 tubes. Zone 4 is similar to Zone 2, only inboard launchers again, a total of 8 tubes. Zone 5 is the 3 center tubes of all 4 launchers, a total of 12. Now you'll notice that the 5 zones have thumb wheel counters which can be set to indicate the type of rockets which are loaded in the specific zones by aircraft armament personnel. And just above each zone arm switch is a rounds remaining counter. The LED readout will decrease each time any rockets are fired, so the pilot knows exactly how many rockets and what type he has available. The zone arm switches are located below these rounds remaining readouts. These switches are pictorial and have a symbolic representation of the specific zone of rockets which they control. The first thumb wheel at the bottom of the panel selects rocket penetration in meters, thus enabling the explosion to occur a predetermined distance after foliage canopy penetration. The increments are in 5-meter intervals from 10 to 45 meters. There's also a super quick setting for point detonation. An additional bunker setting will detonate the rocket after penetration of dirt and logs up to 3 meters in thickness. Rate selects 3 rates of fire: automatic, slow, and fast. In general, the automatic setting will be used since that is the optimum firing rate for the specific type of rockets being used. Mode is a selection of firing. Quad, 1 rocket from each of the 4 launchers. Pairs, 2 rounds, 1 from each side of the aircraft. And single, 1 round, alternating from each side of the aircraft. Quantity is a multiple of the mode switch. It varies from 1, 2, 4, 8, and all. So if the pilot selects 8 for the quantity and has the mode of quad, the system will sequentially fire 32 of the selected rockets. The range switch activates the computer which sets the M439 fuses. The range is adjustable from 500 to 6,000 meters in 100-meter increments. The range switch has an A automatic position for future use with a fire control computer. Until the FCC is incorporated, the A position sets the M439 fuses for 3,000 meters. The press to test switch can be used either in flight or on the ground. The master arm switch on the armament panel must be in the standby mode in order for the test sequence to be initiated. The test validates the entire subsystem, including all associated aircraft wiring. We have spent quite a bit of time going over the cockpit display unit because understanding what it does and how it manages the rocket system is very important to armament personnel. Obviously, the loader must load specific rockets in their respective zones in order for the system to work correctly. Within each zone, the loading can be random, but different rocket types for each zone must be kept separated. Bear in mind that there may well be times when only partial rocket loads can be used. Warhead, weight, altitude, high ambient air temperature, and full fuel loads are factors which can combine to limit the payload that the S can carry for certain stringent missions. Using the bit features of the subsystem, a maintenance technician is able to detect, locate, and correct problems which may occur within the armament loads. Here, a round was not seated properly within the launcher. Or this tube has a rocket which has not had the hook connected. Even defective rocket motor squib can be detected with this bit equipment. Replacement of individual LRUs is easy. Each LRU has a mechanical fault indicator. The flag is tripped any time a malfunction occurs, so replacement can quickly be made. One of the more sophisticated aspects of the rocket management system is the RC fuse subsystem. This is a completely automatic computer system which sets the fusing of each rocket on an individual basis. It automatically compensates for the up to 20% fuse tolerances and gives each rocket an individual fuse setting to achieve the specific range which has been selected. It's the most sophisticated part of the fire control system, but it requires no maintenance other than replacement of any defective LRU. Repairs of these faulty LRUs present no real problem at the intermediate level of maintenance. A single test set is sufficient to isolate the fault, make a diagnosis, and enable you to make repairs. The whole rocket management system has been designed for high reliability and maintainability. No introduction would be complete without a mention of some of the airframe changes that are found in the AH-1S. Perhaps the most important is this new 10 kVA alternator. It makes available through a rectifier 200 additional amps of DC power. That means that this new alternator or the start generator can operate the turret. Such redundancy provides a high degree of combat survivability and increases the probability of mission success if one system is damaged. This has just been an armament preview of the newest version of the Cobra, the AH-1S. Coupled with an already existing tow missile capability, it means that your aircraft can now bring an even greater variety of more potent firepower against a wider variety of targets. All Army aviation technicians perform valuable work, but when it comes to the 68M and J MOS, the work is perhaps even more important, because nobody contributes more to the direct success of the aircraft in its specific combat mission than the work of you armament technicians. Another man's finger may be on the trigger, but in a very real sense, the weapons are in your hands.
5 lines, 6 lines, 3 lines, 5 lines.
Yeah, he doesn't say left 200. Left 200 over.
Where's the binos?
He doesn't normally do that NCOs on.
No.
Fates.
Hey, the binos are in the day pack.
I noticed that when we were doing the fucking.
There is?
Backyard. See, up 40 and fucking.
Toward 87, 66, left extension of Venom 11's window to time 18. Status of reattacks. Venom flight reattacks complete. Push and call.
Hey, Echo.
96, 147. We're done by get you immediate assist rate. Roger. Immediate suppression on that grid.
Max Sword 7,000. Max Sword 7,000.
That's 147. I'd also like to work. Good impacts. Watch 6-4 from lead.
Don't like that effect. Fuck yeah.
Picture putting together a massive jigsaw puzzle where most of the key pieces are missing. That may give you some idea of what the past year has been like for Master Sergeant Cliff Long. As soon as he donated AH-1 Cobra arrived, the mechanic knew restoring it would be a challenge.
And it basically arrived in about 5 different boxes. And we're talking about multi-packs, huge 4x4 boxes.
Even with all those parts, Long fell well short of what he needed to make the Cobra complete enough to be part of a static display at the Combat Readiness Training Center in Gulfport. The 1108th Aviation Group reached out for help across the Department of Defense.
The Cobras have been out of the system since about 1996. This aircraft came mostly stripped down, and every part on it was donated by other DoD agencies and the word of mouth.
The 1108 didn't hesitate to go the extra mile by installing some components that won't be visible to the public, like a working transmission. That's from the Guardsman's desire to recreate memories as authentically as they can.
We're going to go back to a basic paint scheme that the Army paints, which is green. We're going to put all the markings, the original markings back, some sharp teeth on the front, because this is an attack helicopter.
Those that served in Vietnam, it's something that they'll see on the side of the road and they have to just stop. They have to walk over there and they have to look at it and they have to tell the loved ones or whoever they're with that this airframe saved my life.
Soldiers say this restoration is dedicated to those veterans who lost their lives in the name of freedom. For the Gulfport CRTC, I'm Danielle Thomas.
The Sikorsky Blackhawk has been a reliable warhorse for the U.S. Armed Forces. For over 35 years, it has been leading the charge into hostile territory, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. The rhythmic pulse of its blades are both a signal to wounded American men and women that help is on the way, and a warning to enemy forces that trouble is on the horizon. After decades of upgrades, they remain some of the most sophisticated aircraft in the world. But is it possible to create an even more advanced machine using today's technology? What if the world's rotorcraft manufacturers started with a blank sheet and reimagined the helicopter from the ground up? In some ways, Vietnam was a helicopter war. Helicopters were key to moving troops and equipment in and out of hostile territory, and airlifting the wounded to safety. They also fearlessly charged into battle, serving as spotters or leading the assaults themselves. The Bell UH-1 Huey was a vital member of America's stable of helicopters. Though designed as a transport, it would be pressed into many roles under the pressures of war, from rescue craft to flying gunship. Though it was a noble warrior, even with continuous upgrades, it was still largely based on technology from the 1950s, and by the late 60s, the U.S. Army was looking for an upgrade. Their quest for a replacement would lead to the birth of the Black Hawk.
The Black Hawk started out as a replacement for the Bell UH-1 Huey, which was widely used in the Vietnam War, in fact became iconic of the Vietnam War. And they took all that experience they had learned in the Vietnam War and they applied it to the requirement for what was then called the UTTAS or UTAS, which was Utility Tactical Transport Aviation System, in the early 70s.
3 of today's leading rotorcraft manufacturers took up the UTTAS challenge, designing the heir apparent to the Huey: Bell Helicopter, Boeing Vertol, and Sikorsky. After evaluating the proposals, Boeing and Sikorsky were given the go-ahead to construct prototypes. An intense competition between the two designs followed, with the Sikorsky Blackhawk ultimately winning the crown from the Huey. It wasn't long before the Blackhawk was building its own name as a legendary rotorcraft.
Really what made the Black Hawk the helicopter it is they took all that experience they'd learned in the Vietnam War about survivability, about crashworthiness, about the ability to carry a complete team of soldiers, not have to have several helicopters to carry them. And that really made the Black Hawk the utility machine it became.
The Black Hawk design has proven to be so robust that it's been adapted for the Navy as a Seahawk. It's also used around the world with many different countries. It's one of the most ubiquitous helicopter designs of the 20th century.
Extensive modifications have kept the Black Hawk at the forefront of technology, but it is still based on a 40-year-old design. As tough a warrior as the Black Hawk has been, after participating in 2 desert wars, there were questions about its suitability in future air battles. Has the Black Hawk finally reached the end of the line?
Even though they've gone from the UH-60L to the UH-60M and they've got bigger engines and a bigger rotor, they now find themselves operating in high temperatures and high altitudes, and they realize they don't have the performance they thought they had. Not only that, but they're being shot at again and they're crashing in sand and other problems. So they really come back from Iraq and Afghanistan realizing that the helicopter that's done them well for the last few decades is not going to do them well for the next few decades. So they start to lay out their plans for a replacement and to take all that experience they've learned from fighting in the desert and fighting in the mountains and apply it to a new helicopter that they think will be more suited to a future war that is not on a flat, grassy, green battlefield somewhere, but is going to be, they don't know where. And that's the point. They want a helicopter that will fight wherever they end up fighting.
The U.S. Army's FVL, or Future Vertical Lift program, was conceived to explore replacements for not only the Black Hawk, but for the rest of its aging stable of rotorcraft. The new breed of rotorcraft will not only use the latest breakthroughs in technology, they will also share common parts, making building and maintaining the fleet a more economical process. JMR, or the Joint Multi-Role Helicopter Program, is a competition to evaluate the technologies that will go into FVL helicopters.
So JMR is being led by the Army, but it's developing technologies in concert with the other services for the Future Vertical Lift program. In the competition, both Bell and Carrier aircraft were looking at tilt rotors, and AVX and Sikorsky-Boeing were looking at a compound helicopter. Now, each company had a very different take on these approaches, but the key was high speed and long range.
The goal they've set is 230 knots. 230 knots is somewhere between 50 and 100% faster than a Black Hawk. A Black Hawk can do 170 knots It never does 170 knots. The most it'll do is 150 knots. In hot and high, it'll only do 110 knots. So when you talk about 230 knots, you're talking about, in effect, twice as fast as the Black Hawk. And then you're talking about adding the range so they can go twice as far, twice as fast. So that's sort of like a threshold the Army said we want to look at. We want you, industry, to show us, the customer, that we can afford to go twice as fast, twice as far. That's what joint multi-role is all about. It does not mean that the Black Hawk replacement will fly twice as far, twice as fast as a Black Hawk, because the Army might still decide it can't afford to go twice as far, twice as fast.
The JMR competition saw two relative newcomers in the rotorcraft world take up the Army's challenge to go twice as far and fast. The AVX Aircraft Company and Karam Aircraft, a company founded by Abraham Karam, the father of the Predator drone.
So AVX and Karam both had really interesting approaches to this mission requirement. AVX was looking at more of a lower cost version of a high-speed compound, where Karam was looking at a really advanced tilt rotor, which they believed could hit much higher speeds and much longer range with what they call their optimal speed tilt rotor, OSTR.
Bell Helicopter, manufacturer of the V-22 Osprey, put forth a similar-looking rotorcraft for JMR. A byproduct of its tilt rotor design is phenomenal power.
The Bell helicopter design, it's actually a 280 knot machine, which is much faster than the Army says it needs. But that speed actually falls out of the amount of power that it needs to take off and land vertically. So they put these two 5,000 shaft horsepower class engines on it to be able to take off and land vertically at the sort of 30,000 pound gross weight that the Army thinks this thing is going to weigh, which is about 10,000 pounds more than a Black Hawk. And then once you put those rotors down into cruise mode and it becomes a turboprop, you've got the power on board to go 280 knots, maybe even faster. So Bell uses that as an advantage when it does all of its tactical calculations about how many V-280s do you need to cover an area of responsibility, a battlefield. They've got this enormous speed advantage, and speed equals range in this case is how far can you go in a set amount of time. So to them, they use speed as an advantage.
The team of Sikorsky-Boeing have a head start in their Defiant, conceived for JMR, having created two advanced compound helicopter prototypes with their own funds.
Sikorsky-Bell, they've demonstrated with the X2 technology demonstrator that they can go to about 260 knots with this coaxial rotor, rigid coaxial rotor design. The Raider, which is the slightly bigger prototype they're building, they're aiming for about 240 knots. They think it will go faster than that, but they're aiming for about 240 knots, clean, with the weapons tucked away. 220 knots if they have the weapon doors open and the weapons deployed. JMR, they're saying 230 knots. They think it will probably go as fast as 270 knots when it's clean. These are fast machines.
The Army narrowed the field of competitors from 4 to 2. It's not that surprising that Bell Helicopter and Sikorsky-Boeing were the last two left standing. Though all teams had something unique to offer, the Army may have chosen to make a safer bet by siding with the larger companies with a longer proven track record. The great difference in their approaches allow the Army to evaluate two completely different systems.
The approach from Bell is a tilt rotor. The tilt rotor tends to be inherently better at cruise and more efficient for loiter because it has a wing. It can use wing-borne flight. It can use aerodynamics to keep the aircraft aloft rather than the helicopter's rotor pushing down. A compound helicopter, which it basically takes a helicopter and puts a pusher propeller on it to make it go faster, and it can also go farther because it's not using the helicopter rotor to do both lift and forward thrust. And that's what Sikorsky and Boeing are looking at.
The origins of Sikorsky-Boeing's choice of design go back to the early 2000s, when Sikorsky was working on its own. The success of the Black Hawk enabled them to take helicopter technology in new directions.
Sikorsky was making a lot of money on building Black Hawks by the 100 for the Army. And they basically decided to start putting some of that profit into demonstrating technology for what they thought the next generation of rotorcraft would be. Now, they went off and they looked at all the possibilities. They looked at tilt rotor, they looked at variable diameter tilt rotor, they looked at other possibilities, and they came down on a design they'd actually done before.
In the early 70s, Sikorsky developed the XH-59. This was an experimental machine designed to test the advanced blade concept that is using two rigid contra-rotating rotors. Russian manufacturer Karmov had already produced several successful coaxial rotor designs. The concept had great potential, but it had a fatal flaw.
It's a very efficient hovering machine. If you think about it, the rotors get two chances to bite at the air. First rotor pulls the air through, gets some lift, pushes its second rotor, pulls the air through, gets some more lift. Very efficient hovering machine, but slow because you're pushing two rotors through the air when you're going forward. So back in the late 60s, Sikorsky with Army and NASA set out to design a high-speed helicopter and demonstrate they could fly fast with this thing called the XH-59. So the XH-59 had coaxial rotors, but they were very close together. They were very stiff, so they wouldn't bump into each other, but that allowed them to put them only inches apart, which dramatically reduced the drag of the rotor system when they pushed it forward, because the rotors were close together. There wasn't a long, thin mast between the rotors. If you look at a Kamov design, several feet between the rotors. You push that forward, it generates a lot of drag. So they did this, they flew this, they did something around 260, 270 knots. But it was very complicated. It took two pilots to fly this helicopter, and it had four engines. It had two engines driving the rotors and two jet engines pushing it forward. So basically they decided that's not a good idea, and that went back on the shelf.
Though the XH-59 was overly complicated, might advances in technology make the basic concept the foundation for a new generation of helicopters?
In the early 2000s, there's Sikorsky saying, what's the next generation of rotorcraft? And they looked at all of the technology we'd developed since. They looked at fly-by-wire, they looked at composites, they looked at integrated flight and propulsion control, they looked at vibration suppression, active vibration control. And they said, we can do that. We can do what we did with the XH-59, but we can do it with one engine, one pilot, and less vibration at twice the speed of a Black Hawk. So they set out to demonstrate with a thing called the X2 technology demonstrator.
So this uses a very closely spaced coaxial rotor, counter-rotating rotor, and then a pusher propeller. And they've proved with their X2 demonstrator that they could reach speeds of about 250 knots.
Very successful, done as a sort of a rapid prototype in a sort of skunk works type operation. Small team, put it together, flew it. Having shown that, they then decided to put more of their money where their mouth was, and they decided to put $200 million of industry money into building two prototypes of a light tactical helicopter called the S97 Raider.
The X2 and S97 Raider were not developed specifically for the JMR competition. Originally, Sikorsky hoped to replace an aging scout helicopter, the Bell OH-58 Kiowa.
The S97 currently is not part of the future vertical lift family of aircraft. It's a company-funded demonstrator that they would like to have purchased by the Army and other services as a light attack helicopter. The Army has had an outstanding requirement for decades now to develop a new attack scout helicopter. It was going to be Comanche, but then after billions of dollars and a couple decades of development, they ended up having to cancel that program.
Sikorsky hoped by building and flying the X2 and S97 Raider, the Army couldn't help but purchase their design for a new high-speed scout helicopter. It was a gamble that didn't work out as Sikorsky had planned.
Well, it went a bit awry. The Army sort of lost direction, really. And then eventually, when the budgets got tight, the Army decided it couldn't afford an armed scout helicopter. But Sikorsky just kept going, and it will build and it will fly the S97, and they'll demonstrate it to the Army. And they're hoping that, you know, when budgets ease off and the Army realizes that it really does need a scout helicopter, they'll be there and ready when they come back. And there may be other requirements. The special operations folks have still got to replace their Little Bird helicopters, so they think there's something out there that eventually they may come. Meanwhile, the S97 Raider is a good stepping stone towards joint multi-role and future vertical lift. It's significantly bigger than the original technology demonstrator, but it's significantly smaller than the joint multi-role. So joint multi-role takes that next step in size.
Sikorsky has a larger version of the S97 in development, especially for the JMR contest, known as the Defiant. This is a medium-sized helicopter and a Black Hawk replacement. JMR will ultimately call for 4 sizes of helicopter to be produced to replace 25 helicopters currently in operation. Sikorsky's proven ability to scale its compound design could be a key advantage.
If you're in the rotorcraft, the biggest risk you face in designing a helicopter is scaling. Something works at one size, you then go and make it another size, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of problems turn up that you didn't realize. So if you're going to convince the Army that high speed is doable and affordable, you've got to get rid of all the areas of risk that you can. So scaling this up from the X2 technology demonstrator to the S97 Raider and now to the JMR TD allows Sikorsky to remove the risk of scaling.
Sikorsky boosted its odds of success by partnering with another giant in aviation and one of its great rivals.
Along the way, Sikorsky surprised us all by teaming with Boeing for this. Up till then, everybody had expected that Boeing would bid on its own. Not because they really had any incumbency on the Black Hawk. That was Sikorsky's business to win or lose. But because the Army was saying that eventually either the actual vehicle or certainly the technology that was in the Black Hawk replacement would be the basis for the Apache replacement. So Boeing was looking, saying, we're the incumbent on Apache, we've got to protect our turf, we've got to be in on JMR and FVL, because if we're not, and then the Army does decide to take the dynamic system or the entire airframe and repurpose it for the attack mission, we'll be out of the running. So Boeing was doing its own work, and Boeing actually was heading towards a tandem rotor design, because if you look at Boeing, they do a lot, Chinook, very successful. And the mission for the Black Hawk replacement drove Boeing to a tandem rotor. Was never going to that was not going to work, that was not going to be competitive. So eventually they decided to team. So now you have the company that's the incumbent on the Black Hawk and the company that's the incumbent on the Apache, which make up 60% of the Army's helicopter fleet, tied together on the potential replacement for all of those helicopters. They stayed with Sikorsky's X2 configuration, but Boeing brings in its composite airframe technology, its integrated avionics technology, and other things like that to help Sikorsky make this design as competitive as they can.
Though Sikorsky and Boeing made a formidable team, they faced stiff opposition from legendary rotorcraft manufacturer Bell. Bell's V280 Valor builds on many of the lessons learned from years of research in tilt-rotor design.
Bell is describing the V280 Valor as what they call a third-generation tilt-rotor, which makes you go, what are the other 2 generations? Second generation clearly is the V22 Osprey. The first generation is the XV15, the original experimental tilt-rotor that flew back in the 1970s, I think. That was an extremely successful aircraft.
The XV15 proved the potential of the tilt-rotor system. However, when creating the Osprey, designers had a tough challenge meeting the rigid set of new requirements set by the Marines.
One of the challenges with the V-22 Osprey is it had to fit on the Marine Corps' assault ships and to be able to taxi past the island. So that made the wingspan much shorter than it would have liked to have been. Then also having to rotate the wings and fold the blades, make it very compact for storage under the deck, made it more complicated.
So the V-22 ended up having the rotors are too small, the wings too small. It works, but it's a highly compromised tilt rotor. So when we come to the V-280, basically Bell goes back to the original intent of the tilt rotor and has an uncompromised design. Because this thing doesn't have to fold, it doesn't have to go on a deck, it doesn't have to go under a deck, they can make the rotor diameter what it should be, they can make the wingspan what it should be, they can take the forward sweep off that they put on the V-22, they can remove that and have a straight wing which is lighter. And then there's all sorts of other things they had to put into the V-22 so it could operate in a maritime environment that they just can remove. They don't need it for an Army helicopter.
Although Bell had a much freer hand in designing the V-280, there were still many nagging concerns about its tilt-rotor design, the foremost being cost.
Bell, as it builds the Joint Multi-Role demonstrator, is really trying to prove one major point. And that major point is they can build a tilt rotor for the price of a conventional helicopter. If they can't prove they can build this aircraft at a reasonable price, they're dead in the water.
Bell's Osprey has become a vital part of U.S. Marine operations. Its success is strong evidence of the utility and versatility of the tilt rotor. But the V-280 Valor is being constructed for the Army and for a different type of mission altogether.
One of the big things I think Bell has to prove is whether or not a tilt rotor can actually do the mission that the Black Hawk does, which is flying into a firefight to drop off troops, pick up the wounded. You're not talking about the way the V-22 is necessarily operated, which is much more of a transport role.
The V-22 has really proven itself in the conflicts in Afghanistan and around the world with its ability to get in someplace long range, get there fast, hover, land, and get out. So it's really proven itself over the last 7 years it's been in operation.
The tactics that the Marines have evolved with the V-22 to make it survivable is that it stays fast for as long as it can. It basically flies in fast with the rotors down in turboprop mode, and then at the last minute they swing the rotors up into helicopter mode, they land, they load, unload, they take off, they put the turboprops down as quick as they can, and they accelerate out of the danger zone. Their exposure is very limited. That's how they've sort of got around the vulnerability that comes with the complexity of the tilt rotor. Bell has got to prove whether that applies to the Black Hawk mission. If it's going to be hovering more than the V-22 is, it's going to be exposed to fire more.
Ensuring the safety and survival of the crew to and from the target is a key part of any rotorcraft mission dossier. A byproduct of the V-280's tilt-rotor design is an easy escape route.
Because they tilt only the rotors and not the engines, if you think about it, the V-22, they tilt the entire nacelle, so the hot exhaust comes close to the ground when they're in hover mode. In the V-280, they only tilt the rotor, and the engines stay fixed on the ends of the wing. One reason is simplicity. The second reason is so that they can unload the troops from the side doors, and they can run sideways away from the aircraft, which is what they do with the Black Hawk. Whereas in the V-22, they can only go out the back door. Now, out the back door is fine, but you can't exit the aircraft as fast. You can't empty the aircraft or load his aircraft as fast if all of your troops have to go out the back door.
The V-280's side doors provide a faster means of escape than those of the V-22, but both aircraft are enticing targets for enemy fire.
It's hard to say whether a tilt rotor is more vulnerable than a conventional helicopter. It still has engines, gearboxes, rotors, all of which are things that can be shot at. It's really more a case of it's a physically larger signature to shoot at, and it's really this: can they minimize the amount of time that it's on the ground, and can they harden it? I mean, can they make sure that the rotor system can take a shot? On the V-22, they're able to minimize the exposure by the way they operate it. Where the Army may operate a tilt rotor would be very different. So it's going to be a different calculation, and that's going to be a key part of the demonstration.
The Army has a difficult decision to make, choosing between excellent proposals from Bell and Sikorsky-Boeing. They are hopeful that this new rotorcraft will be instilled with one quality absent from the Black Hawk: self-sufficiency.
The Army wants whatever it buys to replace the Black Hawk. It wants it to be able to self-deploy. At the moment, if you go abroad with a Black Hawk, you either have to hop from island to island, in effect, to get somewhere, or you have to pack them up, put them in a C5 Galaxy or a C-17 and fly them. And that takes an enormous amount of strategic airlift to move all of the Black Hawks needed to support an army division or something like that. The goal the army has set is they want to go 2,100 miles, which is the longest leg anywhere in the world. It's Hawaii to Los Angeles, I think. No refueling, all the fuel in extra tanks on board the helicopter. So basically, when an army division deploys, the helicopters will go out on their own and will be waiting when they arrive. That simplifies it for the aircraft designers. They've got to put the fuel in there, but it means you don't have to fold this thing up to go inside an aircraft. You don't have to take the rotors off, make it fit. For Bell, that's a big advantage because that removes one of the big problems of the V-22 is the weight of all that folding mechanism is a huge weight for the V-22 and makes it very, very relatively inefficient for a tilt rotor. With the V-280, they can bolt the wing onto the fuselage. They can go for a very simple structure. It's all composite. The V-22 is composite, but it's what people call black aluminium. If you go in a V-22 and you look at the structure, it looks like it's aluminium. It has fasteners, it has frames, it has stringers, it has all things you'd expect in an aluminium structure, but it's actually carbon fiber. If you go into a V-280, they've gone to the what you can do with composites. Big self-supporting structures, some major frames, but not lots of frames, not lots of stringers. It's basically honeycomb stiffened structure for the wing and the fuselage, which is very light and very simple to produce.
The JMR competition is more of a marathon. Sikorsky-Boeing and Bell are building rotorcraft to test and demonstrate technology only. The actual competition to build the Black Hawk replacement is to follow.
Everybody involved gets a second chance. Not only that, but on the current plans, the Army intends in the FVLM program to fund 2 competing Y-plane prototypes. So we could have a situation where Bell and Sikorsky-Boeing fly their demonstrators in 2017, go into another competition, and then fly Y-plane aircraft in 2025, and then down select to the aircraft that would be finally developed to replace the Black Hawk. So we're a long way from knowing who's won here. And it's important to remember that the Army has this second chance to choose, and also the Army has yet to decide it wants a fast helicopter. After all this, it could decide it wants a conventional helicopter because it's cheaper. After all this, the Army could decide to upgrade the Black Hawk again. It's done it from the A to the L, and from the L to the M. There could be another generation of Black Hawk to come along. They're already planning to put a bigger engine in the Black Hawk, the ITEP engine. Sikorsky also has technology available to put an active rotor on the Black Hawk. I don't know whether in some dark room they've got some way of putting a coaxial rotor on a Black Hawk. We don't know. All we know is it's likely that the Army will upgrade the Black Hawk again, and it's possible they may go for a conventional helicopter to replace their FVL. They may not go for either of the fast rotorcraft.
With the Black Hawk replacement 20 years away, one has to question if the Army's timeline makes sense, and whether the technology developed in that time frame will be worth the wait.
2035 is a very long time from now, but some of that is we want to get this right. This is the first new development aircraft for the Army and most of the other services basically since the 1970s. So we want to see what is possible with the current state of the art, what we can prove, what would be possible for the next generation of aircraft.
Both Bell and Sikorsky-Boeing have excellent designs and proven track records constructing rotorcraft for the U.S. Armed Forces. But who holds the edge in the competition? Perhaps Sikorsky-Boeing's biggest advantage isn't technical. It's that they have the most to lose.
As we stand today, and you look at how the teams are lined up, we've got Bell on one side, we've got Sikorsky and Boeing on the other, and then we have the other 2 players, the small guys who got cut out this time round, the AVX aircraft and Karam aircraft, who may yet attract some bigger backers for the next stage. You have to say to yourself that that it's Sikorsky and Boeing's competition to lose. They are the incumbents on the UH-60 Black Hawk utility helicopter and the H-64 Apache attack helicopter. It's their business to lose. But it's also a huge market. We're talking 3,000 helicopters plus all of the export, thousands of helicopters that export customers buy. Nobody's going to let them just walk in and take that. They're going to have to prove they can do it. They have a good technology base. They've flown the X2 technology demonstrator. They're building the S97 Raider. That configuration with the rigid coaxial rotors and the pusher propeller on the back is going to be well proven by the time they fly their demonstrator.
On May 22, 2015, a test took place critical to the future of Sikorsky-Boeing's compound helicopter design. On that day, the S97 Raider was to lift off for the very first time. Scientists and engineers gathered at the Sikorsky Development Flight Center in West Palm Beach, Florida, to scrutinize the event. They watched anxiously as pilots Bill Fell and Kevin Bredenbeck gingerly took the Raider into the air.
All right, just a few words here. So another first and a proud heritage of first for Sikorsky aircraft is now in the history books. A special thanks goes out to the entire Raider team, Kevin and I, for building this phenomenal machine.
A month after Sikorsky's triumph, it was announced that defense manufacturing giant Lockheed Martin was purchasing the company for $9 billion, perhaps bolstering its hand even more in the helicopter competition. Still, even with the success of the Raider and the added support of Lockheed Martin, victory is not a foregone conclusion. Sikorsky-Boeing still have much to prove to win the next phase of the competition, as do their main rivals, Bell.
Bell has a higher hill to climb. They can offer very high performance with the tilt rotor, but they have got to prove they can build that rotorcraft at an affordable price. They've also got to prove that it can do the Black Hawk mission. The V-22 does not spend a lot of time hovering. Black Hawk spends most of its time hanging around hovering. And so the other thing that Bell's got to prove is they can hang around and hover as efficiently as a rotorcraft. Sikorsky and Boeing don't have that problem. They know that they can hang around and hover efficiently. A coaxial rotor is a very efficient hovering machine. They've got to prove that that whole combination, the complexity of having two main rotors and a propeller on the back and integrating all that propulsion with flight control, they've got to prove to the Army that that's worthwhile. So they've got to prove that it's affordable. They've also got to prove there's some interesting ways you can fly the helicopter when you've got that propeller hanging out the back. You can do flat attitude approaches. You can hang on it, point the helicopter. They've got to prove that that means something in the utility mission. It's not just nice to have, but you can actually do some real things. So they've got some things to prove as well. But as we stand today, you've got to look at what Sikorsky and Boeing have to lose and think that they are going to put everything into winning this. Bell, it's not as existential for Bell. It's not business they now have. If they lose this, they don't lose business they already have. If they win this, they win a market they don't have. But there is no doubt that for the US rotorcraft industry, this competition for FVL, Future Vertical Lift, is the one that's going to decide who dominates the industry for the next 50 years.
It will be a long time before the shape of the next generation of rotorcraft becomes clear. Much time and money is being invested by Sikorsky-Boeing and Bell to create new, faster helicopters. But the Army still might choose to go with a slower, cheaper design. Still, the knowledge gained constructing these awesome machines might still be applied to more conventional rotorcraft. As well, harem aircraft or AVX could make a return to the main stage and strike back with a contract-winning design of their own. All that we can be certain of is that the Black Hawk will soldier on until a new helicopter finally materializes, worthy to relieve it from duty.